The Lord of the World by René Guénon. The Lord of the World. The Lord of the World is the true authority on earth, and reference to him can be found in every tradition. He is associated with the name Manu amongst the Hindus, Metatron amongst the Kabbalists, and Melkizedek in the Judeo-Christian tradition. His abode is sometimes called Agarttha, a place analogous to the Siddhashram of the yogis or the Shambhala of the Tibetan Buddhists. The idea of Agarttha often gives rise to wild and imaginative accounts of secret underground cities and the like, but in this book you can discover what this place really is, and how it functions in the present time phase. The very real fact of the Lord of the World has been buried out of sight in the West, or distorted by supposing that the Lord is an authority solely of the material domain. The true Lord of the World unifies both material and spiritual authority in himself, and is not a satanic or even demiurgic principle. He is the very action of God on this planet. The Lord of the World, by the great traditionalist René Guénon, has never been published in English before. The time has come for this important work to be widely known. We must be ready for an immense event in the divine order which we are traveling towards, with an accelerated speed that must astound all who watch. Awesome oracles have pronounced already that the time is now. The Lord of the World, or Le Roi du Monde, with a biographical note by Pietro Nutrizio. This translation first published in 1983, originally published in 1927 in French as Le Roi du Monde. So there's only, in this document, 76 pages. Preface. This translation introduces English readers for the first time to Guénon's scholarly study of the traditions surrounding the mysterious supreme spiritual center of this planet. First published in French in 1927, it remains one of the most important works on the subject and draws on a wealth of ancient, truly traditional symbolisms. The title, Lord of the World, has been used instead of the more literal King of the World to evoke in the mind of the English-speaking reader the possibility of simultaneous spiritual and temporal authority that the literal rendering of Roi as king would tend to inhibit. In certain places, the translators have added a footnote, or insertion in square brackets, to clarify a point for the English-speaking reader. In certain places, the translators have added a footnote or insertion in square brackets to clarify a point for the English-speaking reader. To avoid the complications of dealing with Guénon's French transliterations of foreign words, the translators have not included diacritical marks, and, as far as possible, standard English transliterations have been used. Some unusual Latin phrases used by Guénon have been left as in the original. The translation has been gone through by Monsieur Yeha, Guénon's heir, who has offered valuable comments and corrected certain errors. Appended to the text is a biographical note on René Guénon by Pietro Nutrizio, included here with the kind permission of Monsieur Yeha. Translation extensively revised by Anthony Cheek and Anthony Blake from original drafts by Carolyn Schaffer, text, and Olga de Notbeck, footnotes. Chapter 1. Western Ideas about Agarttha. Contained in the posthumous work Mission de l'Inde by Saint Yves de Alvidre, published in 1910, second edition, 1949, there is a description of a mysterious center of initiation called Agarttha. Many readers have no doubt assumed it was a purely imaginary story, a sort of fiction without any foundation in reality. In fact, it does contain, if one takes it absolutely literally, unlikelihoods which could justify such an opinion, particularly for those given to seeing only external appearances. The author no doubt had his reasons for not publishing the book himself, although it was written long ago, albeit left unedited. The only previous mention in Europe of Agartha and its chief, the Brahmatma, was made by a rather superficial writer called Louis Jacoliot, in Les Fils de Dieu, pages 236 and 213 through 67 and 272, and Le Spiritisme dans le Monde, pages 27 through 8. Who cannot be considered authoritative and who seems to have heard tell of these things whilst in India, and created his own fantasy about them as he did with the rest. However, in 1924, a book entitled Beasts, Men, and Gods appeared unexpectedly on the scene. In this book, Ferdinand Ossendowski wrote of a thrilling journey made across Central Asia in 1920 and 1921. Using descriptions that tally, especially in the latter part of the book, almost identically with those of Saint Yves. The keen interest aroused by this book has provided a favorable opportunity at last to break the silence on the question of Agartha. There were hostile and skeptical critics, of course, quick to accuse Mr. Ossendowski of plagiarizing Saint Yves, and supporting their case by pointing out the parallel passages in the two books. There are, in fact, a good number which show an astonishing similarity even of detail. For one example, one of the most improbable statements offered by Saint Yves must be that an underground world exists, its network branching everywhere, underneath whole continents, even oceans, to attain and maintain communication with all the regions of this world. Ossendowski does not attempt to verify this from his own experience, and indeed admits that he does not know what to think of it, but gives the testimony of various people he met in the course of his journey. There is also, on more particular points, the passage where the Lord of the World is depicted in front of his predecessor's tomb, and where the question is raised of the origin of the gypsies, who are said to have lived originally in Agartha. We should say that in this connection the existence of peoples in tribulation, of which the gypsies are one of the most striking examples, is truly something very mysterious that demands close examination. Saint Yves writes that there are moments during the subterranean celebration of the cosmic mysteries when desert travelers stop motionless and even animals are silent. Dr. Arturo Regini brought to our attention that this could have some connection with the Timor Panicus of the ancients. This association does indeed seem to us to be extremely likely. Ossendowski assures us that he was present himself at such a moment of universal contemplation. Most important of all, both writers, by strange coincidence, tell of an island now vanished, inhabited by extraordinary men and beasts. Saint Yves cites the summary of the journey by Iambalus, by Diodorus of Sicily, whereas Ossendowski describes the journey of an old Buddhist from Nepal. Both accounts are remarkably similar, so that if there do really exist two versions from such widely different sources, it would be interesting to rediscover them in order to compare them carefully. Although it is necessary to make all these observations, it should be emphasized that we are convinced that the charge of plagiarism is wholly unfounded. In any case, it is not our intention to enter on a discussion which is of little interest for us. Independently of the evidence offered by Ossendowski, we know through other sources that stories of this kind are widely current in Mongolia and throughout Central Asia. and we can add that there is something similar in the traditions of most peoples. From another point of view, however, it is difficult to see why, if Ossendowski did copy parts of the Mission de l'Inde, he should deliberately omit certain passages or change the spelling of words, such as writing Agarttha instead of Agarttha. However, this is easily explained if he was basing his information on a Mongolian source, and not on Saint Yeves's Hindu sources. It is known that the latter had been in contact with at least 2 Hindus. The adversaries of Mr. Ossendowski wanted to explain the same fact by pretending that he had a Russian translation of the Mission de l'Inde at hand. However, the existence of such translation is very doubtful, as the heirs of Saint Yves are totally ignorant of it. Mr. Ossendowski has also been blamed for writing Om, while Saint Yves writes Om, A-U-M. However, while Om as AUM is indeed the representation of the sacred monosyllable split into its constituent elements, Om is the transcription which is both correct and which corresponds to the actual pronunciation as it exists in India, as well as in Tibet and in Mongolia. This detail alone allows one to appreciate the competence of certain critics. Likewise, he would hardly name the head of the initiation hierarchy Lord of the World, when that title does not appear anywhere in Saint Yeves's work. And even if a certain amount of plagiarism were to be admitted, the fact remains that Ossendowski puts forward various original ideas which definitely are not to be found in the Mission de l'Inde, and which he certainly would not have been able to invent in their entirety. Added to which, he was far more preoccupied with politics than with the pursuit of ideas or doctrines, and so ignorant of anything which touched upon the esoteric, that he was manifestly incapable himself of seizing their true import. For example, he tells the story of the Black Stone, that had originally been sent by the Lord of the World to the Dalai Lama, and subsequently taken to Urga in Mongolia, where it disappeared approximately 100 years ago. Mr. Ossendowski, who does not know that the stone is a meteorite, tries to explain certain phenomena, such as the appearing of letters on its surface, by supposing that it was a kind of slate. In fact, black stones play an important role in many traditions, from the one which is the symbol of Cybele to the one which is enshrined in the Kaaba at Mecca. A curious connection should also be made with the Lapsit Exilis, a stone fallen from heaven, on which inscriptions also appear under certain circumstances, and which is identified with the Grail in Wolfgang von Eschenbach's version. What makes the thing still more peculiar is that, according to this same version, the Grail was finally transported to the kingdom of Prester John, which some have wished to identify very precisely with Mongolia, despite the fact that no geographical localization can be accepted literally in this case. See L'Esotérisme de Dante, 1957 edition, pages 35 through 6. Here is another example. The Bogdo Khan, or living Buddha, who resides at Urga, preserves, amongst other precious memorabilia, the ring of Genghis Khan, that is engraved with a swastika and a copper plaque bearing the seal of the Lord of the World. It appears that Ossendowski only managed to see the first of these 2 objects. But if this is so, would it not have been extremely difficult for him to have conjured the other from his imagination? And would it have not been more natural for him to have described a gold plaque? These preliminary observations must suffice, as it is not relevant here to discuss either individuals or polemics. If we cite Ossendowski and even Saint Yves, it is only to serve as a point of departure for considerations well beyond what one might think of either. and the importance of which infinitely surpasses their individualities, as also our own, which should in any case be of no significance in such discussions. Nor is it proposed here to hold a critical examination of their work, but to reveal information that has, to our knowledge, until now been unavailable, and that might help to some extent to clarify what Ossendowski calls the mystery of mysteries. We have been most surprised to learn recently that certain people were trying to pass off the present book as a testimony in favor of a certain personage, whose very existence was totally unknown to us at the time it was written. We most strongly deny any assertion of this kind, from whatever direction it may come, because, as far as we are concerned, this book is exclusively concerned with an account of information belonging to traditional symbolism, and has absolutely nothing to do with any personality whatsoever. Chapter 2, Royalty and Pontificate. The title, Lord of the World, interpreted in its highest, most complete, and most rigorous sense, belongs properly to Manu, the primordial and universal legislator. That is the name that in various forms is found amongst many ancient peoples, Mina or Menes of the Egyptians, the Celtic Menu, and Greek Minos. With the Greeks, Minos was at the same time legislator of the living and judge of the dead. In the Hindu tradition, these two functions belonged to Manu and Yama respectively, who are, moreover, represented as twin brothers, indicating a splitting into two of a single principle considered from two different aspects. In reality, the name describes not a figure that is more or less historical or legendary, but a principle, a cosmic intelligence, that reflects pure spiritual light and formulates the law, dharma, appropriate to the conditions of our world and of our cycle of existence. At the same time, it is the archetype of man in his uniqueness, that is to say, of man as a thinking being, in Sanskrit, Manava. It is important to emphasize that it is this principle that can be manifested through a spiritual center existing in this terrestrial world, by an organization responsible for preserving integrally the repository of sacred tradition, which is of a non-human origin, Aparusheya, and through which primordial wisdom communicates across the ages to those capable of receiving it. The leader of such a center or organization is entitled to use the name and attributes of Manu, whom he represents, as it were. Also, the degree of knowledge which he must have attained to warrant the conferment of this authority enables him to truly identify with the principle of which he is the human expression, and before which his own individuality disappears. Such was the case of Agarttha. If this center received, as indicated by Saint Yves, the inheritance of the ancient solar dynasty, Surya Vansha, which once resided at Ayodhya. The seat of the solar dynasty, if considered symbolically, can be likened to the solar citadel of the Rosicrucians, and doubtless also to the city of the sun of Campanella, and which drew its origin from Vivaswata, the Manu of the present cycle. Saint Yves does not in fact envisage the Lord of the World as the supreme chief of Agarttha, but rather as its sovereign pontiff, whom he places moreover at the head of a Brahmanic church, a somewhat over-westernized conception. This denomination, Brahmanic Church, has, as a matter of fact, never been used in India, but was used by the heterodox modern sect of the Brahma Samaj, arising at the beginning of the 19th century under European and particularly Protestant influences, soon to be divided into a multiplicity of rival branches, and nearly completely extinguished today. One might note in passing that one of the founders of this sect was the grandfather of the poet Rabindranath Tagore. Apart from this point, St. Yves accords completely with Ossendowski. It would seem that both writers took a point of view which complements their personal interests and opinions, without understanding that in fact leadership of Agarttha consisted of a double power, both sacerdotal and royal. The pontifical characteristic in the truest sense of this word belongs very really and par excellence to the chief of the initiation hierarchy. Pontifex means literally builder of bridges, and this Roman title is, in a way, by its origin, a Masonic title. Symbolically, it is he who functions as a mediator, enacting communication between this and higher worlds. St. Bernard said that the pontiff, as indicated by the etymology of this name, is a sort of bridge between God and man. Tractatus de Moribus et Officio Episcoporum, Chapter 3, 9. There is in India a term peculiar to the Jains, and which is the strict equivalent of the Latin pontifex. It is the word Tirthankara, literally, he who makes a ford or crossing. The crossing and point being the way of deliverance, moksha. The Tirthankaras number 24, like the old men of the Apocalypse, who, besides, also constitute a pontifical college. Consequently, the rainbow, or celestial bridge, is used in much the same way by all traditions. For the Hebrews, it is the sign of God's union with his people. For the Chinese, the union of heaven and earth. And for the Greeks, it represents Iris, the messenger of the gods. To the Scandinavians, as well as the Persians and Arabs in Central Africa, and even as far as certain peoples of North America, it signifies the bridge between the material and higher worlds. For the Romans, this union of sacerdotal and royal power represented only one aspect of the extraordinarily complex and diverse symbolism of Janus, whose gold and silver keys depicted the two respective initiations. From another point of view, these keys are those of the great mysteries and of the lesser mysteries, respectively. In certain representations of Janus, the two powers are also symbolized by a key and a scepter. That, using Hindu terminology, would correspond to the way of the Brahmin and that of the Kshatriya. However, at the highest point of the hierarchy, there is one common principle from which the one and other draw their respective attributes, which is therefore above their distinctions. This principle is the source of all legitimate authority, in whatever domain it is exercised, and the initiates of Agarttha are Ativarna, that is to say, beyond caste. In this connection, it can be noted that the social organization of the Middle Ages seems, in principle, to have been copied from the institution of castes. The clergy corresponded to the Brahmins, the nobility to the Kshatriyas, the commonality to the Vaishyas, and the serfs to the Shudras. In the Middle Ages, there was an expression in which these two complementary aspects of authority were reunited in an interesting fashion. During this era, a mysterious country, the kingdom of Prester John, was often mentioned. The matter of Prester John arises particularly around the same time of St. Louis, or St. Louis, in the travels of Carpin and de Rubrique. What complicates matters is that, according to some people, there were as many as 4 personages who bore this title. In Tibet, or in the Pamirs, in Mongolia, in India, and in Ethiopia, this latter word having in any case but the vaguest of meanings, it is likely that it here refers to different representations of the same power. It is also said that Genghis Khan wanted to attack the kingdom of Prester John, but that the latter repulsed him by unleashing thunderbolts against his armies. However, since the time of the Muslim invasions, Prester John has ceased to manifest himself, but would appear to be externally represented by the Dalai Lama. Now this was the time when what could be called the outer covering of the initiation center in question was formed in good part by Nestorians, or those who are rightly or wrongly so called, and by Sabaeans or Sabaeans. In Central Asia, and particularly in the region of Turkestan, Nestorian crosses have been found whose form is exactly similar to those of chivalry, and of which some have, moreover, the figure of the swastika in their center. On the other hand, it is noteworthy that the Nestorians, whose relationship with Lamaism seems undeniable, had an important, if rather enigmatic, influence in the beginnings of Islam. The Sabaeans, on their side, exerted a great influence on the Arab world in the time of the caliphs of Baghdad. It is also said that it is with them that the last of the Neoplatonists found refuge, after a sojourn in Persia, who called themselves the Mendaia of Yahya, or disciples of John. In this context, one is prompted to remark that it is curious that many Oriental groups that were rigidly enclosed communities, from the Ismailis or the disciples of the Old One of the Mountain to the Lebanese Druzes, all without exception took the same title guardians of the Holy Land, as did the Western orders of chivalry. The sequel to what is being discussed may be more easily understood than it first appears, when it is seen that Saint Yves had found a very precise expression, possibly more precise than he knew himself, with the term the Templars of Agarttha. Equally, the meaning of exterior covering may be clarified by noting that initiation into chivalry was essentially an initiation of Kshatriyas. Amongst other things, this explains the dominant role played by the symbolism of love. This particularity has already been pointed out in our study L'Esotérisme de Dante. Leaving aside these considerations, the idea of one individual embodying both priest and king is not widely current in the contemporary West, even though it is found at the origin of the Christian Church, strikingly enacted by the Magi kings. Of course, by the Middle Ages, to outside appearances at least, supreme power had already become divided between the empire and the papacy. In ancient Rome, on the other hand, the emperor was also Pontifex Maximus. The Muslim theory of the caliphate also unites the two powers, at least in some measure, and so does the Far Eastern conception of the Wang. See La Grande Triad, Chapter 7. Such a division marks an organization that is incomplete at its head, since the common principle on which the two powers depend is missing. The true power had then to be found elsewhere. In the East, the maintenance of such a separation at the very summit of a hierarchy is rather exceptional. Only amongst certain Buddhist tenets can one recognize something of the kind. One in question is the affirmed incompatibility between the function of Buddha and that of Chakravarti, or universal monarch. We have noted elsewhere the analogy which exists between the conception of the Chakravarti and Dante's idea of the empire, and in this respect it is appropriate to mention the treatise De Monarchia, between which it is said Shakya Muni had at a certain moment to choose. It is relevant to add that the term Chakravarti, far from being particularly Buddhist, applies very well, following the Hindu tradition, to the function of Manu, or man's representatives, or Manu's representatives. Chakravarti literally means he who makes the wheel turn. That is to say, the one who, being at the center of all things, directs all movement without himself participating in it, or who is, to use Aristotle's words, the unmoving mover. It should be emphasized here that this center constitutes the fixed point known symbolically to all traditions as the pole or axis, around which the world rotates. This combination is normally depicted as a wheel in Celtic, Chaldean, and Hindu traditions. The Celtic symbol of the wheel was retained in the Middle Ages. Many examples of it can be found in Romanesque churches, and the Gothic rose window itself seems to have derived from it, as there is a certain relationship between the wheel and the emblematic flowers, such as the rose in the west and the lotus in the east. Such is the true significance of the swastika, seen worldwide, from the Far East to the Far West, which is intrinsically the sign of the pole. The very sign was not foreign to Christian Hermeticism. We have seen in the ancient Carmelite monastery in Loudun very strange symbols, dating probably from the second half of the 15th century, amongst which the swastika, together with the sign, to which we will refer later, occupies one of the most important positions. In this respect, it is noteworthy that the Carmelites, who came from the East, connect the founding of their order to Elias and to Pythagoras, in the same way as Masonry, on its side, considers itself connected simultaneously to Solomon and to Pythagoras, which constitutes a rather remarkable parallel. Additionally, there are those who claim that in the Middle Ages they had an initiation very close to that of the Templars, as well as to the monks of the Order of Mercy. It is known that this latter order has given its name to a certain grade of Scottish Masonry, about which we have written at some length in Le Esoterisme de Dante. It is doubtless here, for the first time in modern Europe, that its real sense has been made known. Contemporary scholars have vainly essayed all kinds of fantastic theories to explain the swastika symbol, but the majority of them, plagued by fixed ideas, have been unable to comprehend it as anything other than an exclusively solar sign. The same remark can be applied notably to the wheel, of which the true significance has just been indicated. If it has occasionally become such a symbol, it can only have been by accident, as a result of some distortion. Others have come nearer to the truth through perceiving the swastika as a symbol of movement, although this interpretation, without being false, is far from sufficient. It acts not from random movement, but from a rotation effected around an immutable center or axis. It is this fixed point, it should be stressed, that constitutes the essential element to which the symbol in question directly relates. We will only cite as a reminder the opinion, still more fanciful than all the others, which makes of the swastika a diagram of a primitive instrument intended for the production of fire. If this symbol does sometimes have a certain connection with fire, it is in particular an emblem of Agni, it is for quite different reasons. It can be understood now, through what has been said, that the Lord of the world must have a function that is essentially both organizational and regulatory. It is not without reason that this latter word possesses the same root as rex and regere, or regere, so that this function can be summed up in a word such as balance or harmony, corresponding precisely to the Sanskrit term dharma. The root dri expresses essentially the idea of stability. The firm dru, which has the same meaning, is the root of drum, Sanskrit name for the pole, which some compared to the Greek name of the oak, drus. In Latin, moreover, the same word robur signifies force or firmness, as well as oak tree. For the Druids, whose name should perhaps read Druvid, joining force and wisdom, and also at Dodona, the oak tree represented the tree of the world, symbol of the fixed axis that joins the poles, by which we understand the reflection in the manifested world of the immutability of the supreme principle. Consequently, one can understand why the Lord of the world has the fundamental attributes of justice and peace, as they epitomize the balance and harmony inherent in the world of man, Manava Loka. One should remember here the biblical texts in which justice and peace are closely joined. Justitia et pax ostulite sunt. Psalms 84:2. Pax opus justitiae, etc. This is a point of the greatest importance, and beyond its general purport, let it be noted by those who allow themselves certain chimeral fears, such as are faintly echoed in the last lines of Ossendowski's book. Chapter 3, Shekinah and Metatron. Certain timid spirits whose understanding has been curiously limited by preconceived ideas have been so dismayed by the implications of the title Lord of the World that they have found themselves compelled to explain it away as the Princeps Huius Mundi of the Gospels. It is self-evident that such an assimilation is wholly erroneous and without foundation. Of course, the issue could be avoided altogether by simply observing that the title in Hebrew and in Arabic equally applies to God himself. There is, however, a great difference of meaning between the world and this world, to the point that in certain languages there exist two entirely distinct terms. Thus, in Arabic, the world is El Alam, while this world is Ed Dunya. But while that also might provide some interesting avenues to pursue, we are more concerned here with the theories of celestial intermediaries in the Hebrew Kabbalah that have a direct bearing on the principal subject of this study. These celestial intermediaries are Shekinah and Metatron. Shekinah denoting in a general sense the real presence of the divine. The scriptures that make special mention of this presence are mainly those that are concerned with the establishment of a spiritual center, such as the construction of the tabernacle and the temples of Solomon and Zorobabel. Such a center, set up according to rigorously denned conditions, should be in effect a place of divine manifestation, always represented by light. It is interesting to note that a description retained by the Masonic order of a very light and equable place seems to be a memory left over from the ancient sacerdotal science that directed the construction of the temples, and that, by the way, was not peculiar to the Jews. This will be discussed later. It is not necessary here to elaborate on the theme of spiritual influences, a better translation of the Hebrew barakoth, than the usual blessings, more particularly as it keeps the sense which the Arabic baraka has retained. But even if one does only consider these things from this one point of view, the Jewish, it is possible to explain the words of Elias Levita, who is quoted by Vouliard in his La Kabbalah Juive, as saying the masters of the Kabbalah hold the great secrets on this matter. The Shekinah presents two leading aspects out of its many facets, one that is internal and the other external. There is in the Christian tradition an expression that describes these two aspects in the clearest possible way. Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis. Glory refers to the internal aspect or manifested world. If these words are considered, it is possible to understand immediately why they are spoken by the angels, or malachim, in order to announce the birth of God with us or in us, Emmanuel. It also explains, in relation to the first aspect, various theological expositions on the light of glory, in and by which the beatific vision is revealed, in excelsis. The second aspect, peace, has already been referred to. Esoterically, it is known as one of the fundamental attributes retained by the spiritual centers of this world, in Terra. In any case, the Arabic term, Sakma, a word of identical derivation to that of the Hebrew Shekinah, translates as Great Peace, which is an exact equivalent of the Pax Profunda of the Rosy Cross, and hence one can certainly explain what the latter meant by the Temple of the Holy Spirit. Likewise, one could interpret in a precise fashion the numerous gospel texts in which peace is mentioned. Moreover, the Gospels themselves explicitly declare that this term does not mean peace as understood by the secular world. St. John 14:27. And also the suggestion that the secret tradition of the Shekinah has a connection with the light of the Messiah. Is it unintentionally that M. Vouliard, in giving this last indication, La Kabbale Juive 6:503, says that this is a tradition reserved for those who pursue the path leading to Pardes? Ibid 1:506-7. That is to say, as will be seen later, to the supreme spiritual center. This question leads to another remark. M. Vouliard speaks subsequently of a mystery related to the Jubilee, the garden traditionally symbolizing Jewish mystical practice. This question leads to another remark. M. Vouliard speaks subsequently of a mystery related to the Jubilee, Ibid 1:506-7, and also the Jewish year of emancipation and restoration. That he relates in one sense to the idea of peace, citing in this context the text of the Zohar 3:52b. The river that flows out of Eden bears the name Lobel, and that of Jeremiah 17:8. It stretches its roots towards the river, which leads to the central idea of the Jubilee is the return of all things to their original state. It is clear that this return to the primordial condition is seen in all traditions, a theme that was quite strongly stressed in our work, La Esoterisme de Dante. Those who have read this book will be able to make a connection between what was written there about terrestrial paradise and celestial Jerusalem, and the statement that the return of all things to their primary state will herald the Messianic era. The essential interest in all this is that in the various phases of cyclical manifestation it is the Pardes, the center of this world, that in the traditional symbolism for all cultures is compared to the heart, the center of being and divine residence, the Brahmapura in Hindu doctrine. The tabernacle made in its image is hence called the habitacle of God, or Mishkan, a word deriving from the same root form as Shekinah. From another point of view, the Shekinah is the synthesis of the Sephiroth. Thus, the right-hand column of the Sephirothic tree denotes the side of mercy, and the left-hand column that of rigor. An absolutely comparable symbolism is expressed by the medieval figure of the tree of the quick and the dead, which has, moreover, a very clear connection with the idea of spiritual posterity. Note that the Sephirothic tree is also believed to be identical with the tree of life. The French word rigueur has connotations of law, karma, and order. The usual English word justice would be confusing here. One ought also to find both aspects in the Shekinah, where one can say that justice stands for rigor and peace for mercy. According to the Talmud, God has two seats, the seat of justice and the seat of mercy. These two seats also correspond to the throne and to the chair of Islamic tradition. On the other hand, the latter divides the divine names, Sifatia, i.e. of those which express the properly so-called attributes of Allah, into names of majesty, Jalaliyah, and names of beauty, Jamaliyah, which further corresponds to a distinction of the same order. If a man sins and strays from the Shekinah, he falls under the power of those forces, Sarim, that depend on the rigor. La Kabbale Juive 1:507. Thus, the Shekinah is called the hand of discipline, a description that immediately recalls the well-known symbol, the hand of justice. This appears at first to contradict the maxim, if a man approaches the Shekinah, he will be liberated. But as the Shekinah is the right hand of God, then it can be seen that the hand of justice becomes the hand that blesses. According to St. Augustine and various other fathers of the Church, the right hand in the same way represents mercy or goodness, whereas the left hand, with God especially, is the symbol of justice. The hand of justice is one of the ordinary attributes of royalty. The blessing hand is a sign of sacerdotal authority, and has sometimes been taken as a symbol of Christ. The figure of the blessing hand can be found on certain Gaulish coins, as well as the swastika, sometimes with curved arms. This is the mystery of the house of justice, Beth Din, which is yet another designation of the supreme spiritual center. This center, or any one of those which are constituted in its image, can be symbolically described as a temple, sacerdotal aspect corresponding to peace, and at the same time as a palace or court of law, royal aspect corresponding to justice. It is scarcely necessary to point out that the two sides under discussion are represented in the Christian religion by the paths of the saved and the damned, following the last judgment. One could equally establish a connection with the two paths symbolized by the Pythagoreans in the letter Y, or upsilon, represented exoterically by virtue and vice in the Herculean myth, also by the two doors, celestial and infernal, associated by the Romans with the symbolism of Janus, and by two cyclical ascending and descending phases. We have here the two halves of the zodiacal cycle, which one can often find represented on the doorways of medieval churches in an arrangement which obviously gives it the same significance. Associated by the Hindus with Ganesh. All the symbols enumerated here would need to be explained at length. We may perhaps do so in another work. These examples provide a clear understanding of what is truly meant by such expressions as right intention, of which more later, and goodwill, pax hominibus bone voluntatis. Those familiar with the various symbols referred to will see that it is not without reason that Christmas coincides with the winter solstice, especially if one leaves aside all those externalist moral and philosophical interpretations which have arisen from the time of the Stoics through to Kant. The Kabbalah gives the Shekinah a deputy. The French word paradre means a lesser deity, but can be used semi-adjectively as here. That bears names identical to its own, and that consequently possesses the same characteristics. La Kabbale Juive 1:497-8. And that naturally also possesses as many attributes that differ from those of the Shekinah itself. Its name is Metatron, a title that is numerically equivalent to Shaddai, the All-Powerful, said to have been the name of the God of Abraham. The origin of the word Metatron is most obscure. One of the most interesting among the many hypotheses that have been advanced is its derivation from the Chaldean Mitra, which means rain, but relates through its root form with light. Even accepting this proposition, there is still no valid reason for believing that similarity with Hindu and Zoroastrian Mitra represents a borrowing by Judaism from foreign doctrines, as it is not useful to envisage the relationship that exists between the different traditions in such an external manner. For most traditions, the symbol of rain signifies the descent of spiritual influences from heaven to earth, In this connection, Hebraic doctrine describes a dew of light emanating from the tree of life, and through which there occurs the resurrection of the dead, whilst both alchemical and Rosicrucian symbolism is recalled by the effusion of dew that represents the celestial influence communicating with all the worlds. The term Metatron conveys the multiple meanings of the guardian, lord, messenger, and mediator. It is the author of the theophanies, God's manifestation, in the perceptible world. La Kabbale Juive 492 and 499. It is the angel of the face, and also the prince of the world, Sar Ha-Olam. And this last designation indicates that we have in no way strayed from the subject. The traditional symbolism that has been explained up to now may be employed to convey the idea that in the same way as the leader of the initiatory hierarchy is the terrestrial pole, so Metatron is the celestial pole, and the one reflects the other, being in direct contact through the axis of the world. His name is Michael, the great priest, who is the burnt offering and oblation before God. And everything the Israelites do on earth is the reflection of a celestial action. The great pontiff here below represents Michael, Prince of Clemency. Every part of the scripture that tells of an appearance of Michael is concerned with the glory of the Shekinah. La Kabbale Juive 1:501. Although said here of Israelites, it could equally apply to all peoples inheriting a genuinely orthodox tradition. The point should be made even more strongly for the representatives of the primordial tradition, from which all the rest derive and to which they are all subordinate. This is in tune with the symbolism pertaining to the Holy Land, an image of the celestial world that has been referred to already. To revert to the previous subject, Metatron possesses not only the attribute of mercy, but also that of justice. It is not only the great priest, Kohen HaGadol, but also the great prince, Sar HaGadol, and commander of the celestial militia. That is to say, it is the principle of royal power, as well as of that sacerdotal or pontifical power that corresponds to the function of mediator. It is worth noting that Melek, king, and Malek, angel or messenger, are in fact two forms of one and the same word. Moreover, Malachi, my messenger, that is to say, messenger of God or angel in whom God dwells, Maliach ha-Elohim, is an anagram in Hebrew of Michael. Although Michael is identified with Metatron, he represents only one aspect. Beside the luminous face, there is a dark face represented by Samael, also known as Sar Ha-Olam. In fact, it is this latter aspect, and it only, which symbolizes in a lower sense the spirit of the world, or the Princeps Huius Mundi, referred to in the Gospels. Samael's relationship with Metatron as the latter's shadow, so to say, justifies the use of the same title in a twofold sense, as well as making it clear why the number of the beast, the apocalyptic 666, is also a solar number. This number is formed in particular by the name of Sorath, demon of the sun, and opposed as such to the angel Michael. Later we will see another significance of this number. To quote Saint Hippolytus, in conclusion, cited by Voliad, La Kabbale Juive 2:273, the Messiah and the Antichrist both have the lion for their emblem, another solar symbol. The same remarks may be applied to the serpent. The two opposing aspects are figured in particular by the two serpents of the Caduceus. In Christian iconography, they are united in the Amphis Baina, the two-headed serpent, one of which represents Christ, the other Satan, and two many other symbols. From a Kabbalistic viewpoint, we have here the two opposite faces of Metatron. We need not go into the theories we might formulate on this double meaning of symbols, only noting that the confusion between the luminous and the dark aspects is what properly constitutes Satanism. It is precisely this confusion that allows some, unintentionally and through simple ignorance, an excuse, not a justification, to believe that an infernal significance is to be found in the title Lord of the World. Let us further point out that the globe of the world, insignia of imperial power or of universal monarchy, is frequently placed in the hand of Christ, which shows, moreover, that he is the emblem of spiritual authority as well as of temporal power. Chapter 4. The Three Supreme Functions. According to Saint Yves, the supreme head of Agarttha holds the title of Brahmatma. Brahmatma would be more correct, or sustainer of souls in the Spirit of God. His two advisors are the Mahatma, representative of the universal soul, and Mahanga, symbol of the entire material organization of the cosmos. Ossendowski uses Brahitma, Mahitma, and Mahinga. They comprise the hierarchical division established in Western terms by the triad spirit, soul, and body, that may be applied here within the analogical framework of the microcosm and macrocosm. It is important here to know that Sanskrit terminology defines only the principle inherent in these designations, and cannot be applied to human beings, except insofar as they represent these principles. And even then it only applies to their functions, not their individualities. Ossendowski describes the Mahatma as knowing the events of the future, and the Mahanga as controlling the causes for these events, while the Brahmatma is able to speak to God face to face. We have seen above that Metatron is the angel of the face. This phrase is easily understood if it is remembered that Brahmatma occupies the central position from where direct communication is established between the terrestrial world and higher states, and through them with the supreme principle. According to Far Eastern tradition, the invariable middle is the point where the activity of heaven is manifested. If the term Lord of the World were to be interpreted in a restrictive sense in accordance with an understanding only of the terrestrial world, it would prove inadequate. It would be more accurate in certain respects to name Brahmatma king of the three worlds. We could ask those who might be surprised at such an expression if they have ever reflected upon the significance of the triregnum, the three-crowned tiara, which is, with the keys, one of the principal insignia of the papacy. For in every authentic hierarchy, he who possesses the highest qualifications possesses, by the same token, all subordinate qualifications, so that the three worlds which comprise the Tribhuvana of Hindu tradition are the domains that correspond respectively to the three functions previously enumerated. When he comes out from the temple, writes Ossendowski, the Lord of the world radiates the divine light. The Hebrew Bible reports exactly the same of Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai. It is also said that Moses had then to cover his face with a veil to speak to the people who could not bear its brilliance. Exodus 24:29-35. In the symbolical sense, this indicates the necessity for an exoteric adaptation for the multitude. Let us recall in this connection the double significance of the word reveal, which can mean to draw aside the veil, but also to cover with a veil, or reveal. It is also thus that the word manifests and veils at the same time the thought it expresses. It is worth noting that Islamic tradition regards Moses as the pole, el-Kitab, of his era. Is it not for this reason that he was instructed according to the Kabbalah by Metatron himself? It is worth distinguishing at this point between the principal spiritual center of our world and those subordinate secondary centers that only represent the former in respect of their particular traditions specially adapted for particular communities. Without laboring the point, I should nevertheless add that the function of legislator, Arabic Rasul, belonging to Moses necessarily supposes a delegation of the power that is the sign of Manu. One meaning implicit in the Manu signifies precisely the reflection of the divine light. The Lord of the world, said Lama to Ossendowski, is in touch with the thoughts of all those who direct the destiny of mankind. He knows their intentions and their ideas. If these are pleasing to God, the Lord of the world favors them with his invisible aid. But if they are displeasing to God, he puts a check on their activities. This power is given to Agarttha through the mysterious science of Om, the word we use to begin our prayers. Immediately afterwards comes a phrase that, for those who do not know the significance of the sacred monosyllable, should occasion great surprise. Om is the name of an ancient saint, the first guru, who lived 300,000 years ago. This sentence would be completely unintelligible were it not borne in mind that the era mentioned, apparently so vaguely, far precedes that of the present Manu. Moreover, the Adi Manu, or first Manu of our present Kalpa, Vivaswata being the seventh, is called Swayambhuva, or issue of Swayambhu, that which subsists of itself, in other words, eternal Logos. Now, the Logos, or he who represents it directly, can truly be called the first Guru, or spiritual master, which means that Om is, in effect, another one of its names. This name is rather surprisingly also found in the ancient Christian symbolism, where, among the signs serving to represent Christ, one, later considered an abbreviation of Ave Maria, was originally an equivalent of the one that unites the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, Alpha and Omega, to signify that the word is the principle and the end of all things. In reality, it is even more complete, as it signifies the beginning, the middle, and the end. This sign, in fact, breaks down into AUM, or Om, i.e. the three Latin letters which correspond to the three constituent elements of the monosyllable Om, the vowel O in Sanskrit being formed by the union of A and U. The association of this sign, Om, and the swastika, both taken as symbols of Christ, seems particularly significant seen from the position we are taking. Furthermore, one must note that the form of this same sign presents two threefold entities placed in opposite ways to each other, which makes them in certain respects an equivalent to the Seal of Solomon. If one considers the latter in the form, where the horizontal median line specifies the general significance of the symbol by marking the plane of reflection or surface of the waters, one sees that both figures comprise the same number of lines, and in reality only differ by the disposition of two of them, which, being horizontal in one, become vertical in the other. The word Om at once provides a key to the hierarchical allocation of functions pertaining to Brahmatma and his two advisors. According to Hindu tradition, the three components of this sacred monosyllable represent the three worlds, just mentioned of the Tribhuvana: earth, Bhu, atmosphere, Bhuvas, and sky, Swar, which, to use a different terminology, correspond to the corporeal manifestation, the world of subtle or psychic manifestation, and the non-manifest world of the principle. A more ample development of this conception of the three worlds is found in our earlier works, La Esoterisme de Dante and Man and His Becoming according to Vedanta. In the first, we have mainly stressed the correspondence of these worlds, which are in fact states of mind, with degrees of initiation. In the second, we have in particular given a complete explanation from the purely metaphysical point of view of the text of the Mandukya Upanishad, in which the symbolism here in question is set out in full. The present discussion covers only the particular application. They describe in ascending order the worlds of Mahanga, Mahatma, and Brahatma, as can easily be seen by referring to the interpretation of their titles given above. These form the sequence of subordination existing between the different domains that justifies the previous interpretation of Brahatma as Lord of the three worlds. In the order of universal principles, the function of Brahatma refers to Ishvara, that of the Mahatma to Hiranyagarbha, and that of the Mahanga to Viraj. Their respective attributes could easily be deduced from this correspondence. This being is the Lord of all things, the omniscient, seeing instantaneously all effects in their cause, the inner organizer residing at the center of the world and ruling it from within, directing its movement without participating in it. He is the source of all legitimate power, the beginning and end of all beings that belong to the cyclical manifestation in which he represents the law. Mandukya Upanishad, Shruti 6. To use another symbolism, no less exact, the Mahanga represents the base of the initiatic triangle, the Brahatma its summit, and between the two, the Mahatma embodies in a certain way the reconciling principle, the cosmic vitality, the anima mundi of the Hermeticists, the action of which is deployed in intermediary space. All this is depicted very clearly through the corresponding characters of the sacred alphabet, called by St. Yves Vatan and Vatanan by Ossendowski, and also by the geometric forms, straight line, spiral, and point, to which the three matras, elements constituting the monosyllable Om, can be reduced. This can be defined more exactly. The fullness of both sacerdotal and royal power, seen as principles in a kind of undifferentiated state, belongs to the Brahatma. The two powers subsequently divide in order to manifest, the Mahatma specifically representing sacerdotal power, and the Mahanga royal power. The distinction is comparable to that between Brahman and Kshatriya, although in other respects the Mahatma and the Mahanga, being beyond castes, have themselves, like the Brahatma, elements of both powers. This raises a point that has never been explained satisfactorily, yet is most important. It has been mentioned already that the two powers were united in the Magi Kings of the Gospels. Now it can be revealed that these mysterious personages represented in truth nothing other than the three leaders of Agarttha. St. Yves does indeed say that the Magi Kings came from Agarttha, but without bringing any precision to this statement. The names usually attributed to them are doubtless imaginary, excepting, however, that of Melchior, in Hebrew, King of the Light, which is rather significant. The Mahanga offers gold to Christ and hails him as king. The Mahatma, offering incense, greets him as priest, and the Brahatma, greeting him as prophet or spiritual master par excellence, proffers myrrh, the symbol of Amrita and balm of incorruptibility. The Amrita of the Hindus, or the ambrosia of the Greeks, two words etymologically identical, drink or food of immortality, was also clearly seen in the Vedic Soma and the Mazdaean or Zoroastrian Haoma. Trees producing incorruptible gum or resin play an important role in symbolism. They have, in particular, sometimes been taken as emblems of Christ. The homage rendered in this way to the newborn Christ by the authentic representatives of the primordial tradition in the three worlds, which are their respective domains, is at the same time, one should note, a sign of the perfect orthodoxy of Christianity in this respect. Of course, Ossendowski was not in a position to consider ramifications of this order. Indeed, if he had understood certain things more profoundly, he would have noticed at least the strict analogy existing between the supreme triumvirates of the Agarttha and of Lamaism as he describes it. He points out that the Dalai Lama embodies the saintliness or pure spirituality of the Buddha, the Tashi Lama his science, not magic as he appears to think, but rather theurgy, and the Bogdo-Khan represents his material and warrior power, as identical allocation of function to that dividing the three worlds. He should have drawn the parallels even more readily, since he was told that the capital of Agarthi recalls Lhasa, where the Dalai Lama's palace, the Potala, is situated on top of a mountain that is covered over with temples and monasteries. Through reversing the emphasis of the relationship, this sort of explanation is erroneous, for in reality it is the image that recalls its prototype, not the other way around. Thus, the center of Lamaism is merely an image of the true center of the world. But all centers of this kind possess, according to the locality where they are founded, certain topographical peculiarities that, far from being unimportant, have an irrefutable symbolic value that must correspond to those laws through which spiritual influences operate. This last topic actually belongs to an area of traditional science which one could call sacred geography. There is another, no less remarkable parallel. Saint Yves, describing the different degrees or circles of the initiatic hierarchy, which correspond specifically to certain symbolic numerals, particularly those of the divisions of time, concludes, "The highest circle nearest to the mysterious center is composed of 12 members, who represent the supreme initiation and correspond, among other things, with the zodiacal zone. This constitution is reproduced in what is known as the Circular Council of the Dalai Lama, a council comprising 12 grand namshans or nomicons, a form also found in certain Western traditions such as Knights of the Round Table. Seen from the sphere of cosmic order, the 12 members of Agartha's inner circle represent not only the 12 signs of the zodiac, but also, it is tempting to say, rather, although neither interpretation negates the other, the 12 Adityas, which are as many forms of the sun, acting in concord with these zodiacal signs. It is said that the Adityas, issue of Aditi, or the indivisible, were first 7 before being 12, and that their chief was then Varuna. The 12 Adityas are Datri, Mitra, Aryaman, Rudra, Varuna, Surya, Bhaga, Vivasvat, Pushan, Savitri, Tavashtri, and Vishnu. They are so many manifestations of a unique and indivisible essence. It is also said that these 12 suns will appear simultaneously at the end of the cycle, entering then into the essential and primordial unity of their common nature. With the Greeks, the 12 great gods of Olympus are also in correspondence with the 12 signs of the zodiac. And naturally, as Manu Vivaswata is called son of the sun, so also does the Lord of the world count the sun amongst his emblems. The symbol alluded to here is exactly the one that Catholic liturgy attributes to Christ when it applies the title of Sol Justicii to him. The word is effectively the spiritual sun, i.e. the true center of the world. Besides, the expression Sol Justicii refers directly to the attributes of Melkizedek. To be noted also is that the lion, solar animal, is, in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, an emblem of justice as well as of power. The sign of the lion in the zodiac is the proper residence of the sun. The sun with 12 rays can be considered as representing the 12 Adityas. From another point of view, if the sun represents the Christ, the 12 rays are the 12 apostles. The word apostolos signifies sent, and the rays are also sent by the sun. In the number of the 12 apostles, one can, moreover, see a sign, among many others, of the perfect conformity of Christianity with the primordial tradition. The first conclusion arriving from what has been said is that certain very close similarities exist between the different accounts found in all countries of spiritual centers which are more or less hidden or at least difficult to access. The only plausible explanation for this similarity lies in the assumption that if the accounts refer to different centers, as seems to be the case at least for some, then they must all be emanations from one unique and supreme center, just as all individual traditions are but adaptations of the great primordial tradition. Symbolism of the Grail. The Knights of the Round Table were briefly mentioned in the previous chapter. It is not inappropriate here to indicate the significance of the quest for the Grail, presented in Celtic legends as their chief function. A something that becomes lost or hidden at some past time is mentioned by every tradition. It is, for instance, the soma of the Hindus and the Persian heoma, or drink of immortality. In the same way, the Grail is the sacred chalice containing the blood of Christ, which is also the drink of immortality. Elsewhere, the symbolism is different, as for example in the Jewish tradition, where it is the pronouncing of the great divine name that has been lost. In this respect, one must also remember the lost word of Masonry, which likewise symbolizes the secrets of the true initiation. The search for the lost word is thus but another term for the quest for the Grail. This justifies the relationship pointed out by the historian Henry Martin between the Maçonnerie du Saint Graal and Masonry. Cf. L'Esotérisme de Dante, 1957 edition, pages 35 through 36. The explanations given here will facilitate understanding of our previous discussion of the very close connection which exists between the symbolism itself of the Grail and the common center of all initiatory organizations. See addendum below, page 30. Addendum on the Maçonnerie of the Holy Grail, from L'Esotérisme de Dante, pages 35 through 36. A hero named Titurel founds a temple in order to deposit therein the holy vessel, and it is the prophet Merlin who directs the mysterious construction, initiated as he had been by Joseph of Arimathea, in person into the plan of the preeminent temple, the Temple of Solomon. Here, Henry Martin adds as a note, Parzival ends up by transferring the Grail and rebuilding the temple in India. Parzival ends up by transferring the Grail and rebuilding the temple in India. And it is Prester John, the fantastic chief of an imaginary Oriental Christendom, who inherits the guardianship of the holy vessel. The chivalry of the Grail becomes the Maçonnerie, i.e. an ascetic Freemasonry whose members are called the Templistes, and one can perceive here the intention to connect to a common center, figured by this ideal temple, the Order of the Templars, and the numerous confraternities of builders who then renovated the architecture of the Middle Ages. One can catch a glimpse of many openings on what one could call the underground history of those times, much more complex than is generally thought. What is odd, and what one can hardly doubt, is that modern Freemasonry goes back, step by step, as far as the Maçonnerie of the Holy Grail. The fundamental idea, however, always remains the same, and we will shortly see to what it exactly corresponds. It is said that the Holy Grail is the chalice of the Last Supper, and that it was used by Joseph of Arimathea at the crucifixion to catch the blood and water flowing from the wound opened in Christ's side by the lance of the centurion Longinus. This name of Longinus, or Longinus, is related to the name for the spear itself, in Greek logche, pronounced lonki. The Latin lancea has, moreover, the same root. As legend relates, the chalice was taken to Great Britain by Joseph of Arimathea himself and Nicodemus. Here, the two personages represent royal power and sacerdotal power respectively. The same applies to Arthur and to Merlin in the institution of the Round Table. Here, one can see the indication of a link established between Christianity and Celtic tradition. The chalice plays an important role in most ancient traditions, and particularly so among the Celts. It is frequently associated with the lance. The two symbols are somewhat complementary, but that is taking us away from the point. We will only say that the symbolism of the lance is often connected to the axis of the world. In this respect, the blood which drips from the lance has the same significance as the dew emanating from the tree of life. Besides, it is known that all traditions affirm unanimously that the vital principle is intimately linked with blood. The essential significance of the Grail is best understood through various descriptions of its origin. The chalice is said to have been fashioned by angels from an emerald that dropped from Lucifer's forehead at the time of his fall. Some people say it is an emerald fallen from the crown of Lucifer, but there is a confusion here, occurring because Lucifer before his fall was the angel of the crown, i.e. of Keter, the first Sephirah. In Hebrew, Hakathriel, a name which, moreover, has the number 666. And I found this is probably the spelling HK, or Hey, Kaf, Tau, Resh, Yod, Aleph, Lamed. HK. It is said, too, that the Grail had been entrusted to Adam in the terrestrial paradise, but that he lost it and he was unable to take it with him on his banishment from Eden. Thus, man, separated from his center of origin, found himself trapped in a temporal realm, and where he could no longer rejoin that unique place in which all things are contemplated from the standpoint of eternity. In other words, the possession of the sense of eternity corresponds to what all the traditions call the primordial state, whose restoration constitutes the first stage of the true initiation, being the preliminary requirement for the effective conquest of the suprahuman states. Concerning this primordial state, or Eden-like state, see L'Esotérisme de Dante, 1957 edition, pages 46 through 48, and 68 through 70. And Man and His Becoming according to Vedanta, page 176. Furthermore, terrestrial paradise stands for the center of the world, an expression that will be understood later on when the original meaning of paradise is analyzed. Seth obtained permission to return to the terrestrial paradise, and so was able to recover the precious chalice. Now, the name Seth denotes qualities of reliability and stability. Consequently, it also indicates to some extent the restoration of the primordial order destroyed by man's fall. It is said that Seth remained 40 years in the terrestrial paradise. This number 40 has also a meaning of reconciliation, or return to the principle. The periods measured by this number are often met with in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Let us remember the 40 years of the flood, the 40 years during which the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, the 40 days that Moses spent on Mount Sinai, Christ's 40-day fast. Lent has naturally the same significance, and more examples could doubtless be found. It can be understood from this that both Seth and those who possessed the Grail after him were able, through that ownership, to establish a spiritual center destined to replace their lost paradise, and which was like an image of it. This possession of the Grail then represents the integral preservation of the primordial tradition in a spiritual center. Legend does not record where or by whom the Grail was kept until the time of Christ, although its Celtic origin suggests the Druids had a part in it and should be counted amongst the regular guardians of the primordial tradition. The loss of the Grail, or of one of its symbolic equivalents, signifies the loss of tradition, with all that this conveys. It is truer, in fact, to say that the tradition is hidden rather than lost, or to say that it can be lost only to lesser spiritual centers that have ceased to maintain a direct contact with the Supreme Center. This last always keeps the tradition intact, and remains untouched by any changes occurring in the exterior world. It was thus said that, according to various church fathers, notably St. Augustine, the flood failed to reach terrestrial paradise, the dwelling place of Enoch and land of saints. And Enoch walked with God, and he appeared no more in the visible or external world, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. He would then have been transported to the terrestrial paradise. This is what certain theologians like Tostat and Cajetan also believe. See what is said below about the land of saints, or land of the living, where its summit touches the lunar sphere. This means that it is to be found beyond the domain of change, the sublunar world, at the point of communication between Earth and the heavens. This conforms with the symbolism used by Dante, placing the terrestrial paradise on the top of the mountain of purgatory, which for him identifies with the polar mountain of all traditions. In the same way that the terrestrial paradise has become inaccessible, the Supreme Center, which is basically the same thing, can remain concealed during the course of certain periods without any external manifestation whatsoever. In this state, it can be said that the tradition is lost to humanity as a whole, for it is conserved only in centers so emphatically closed that the majority of people have no means of participating consciously or effectively, in contrast to the original situation. The Hindu tradition teaches that there was only one caste originally, named Hamsa. This signifies that all men possessed normally and spontaneously the spiritual degree designated by this name, which is beyond the distinctions of the present four castes. Such is the state of this present epoch, the beginning of which reaches back well beyond what is accessible to ordinary and profane history. The loss of tradition can therefore be considered both in this general sense and also allied to the veiling of spiritual centers ruling more or less invisibly the destinies of particular people's civilizations. One must therefore examine each example of symbolism of this kind to see in which of these two senses it should be interpreted. From what has been said, it follows closely that the Grail represents two closely united entities. He who fully owns the primordial tradition, who has reached the degree of effective knowledge implied by this possession, is, through this, effectively reintegrated in the fullness of the primordial state. Both the primordial state and the primordial tradition convey the double meaning inherent in the word Grail itself, owing to one of those verbal assimilations which play quite a significant part in the field of symbolism, and which carry a more profound meaning than is at first obvious. The Grail is at once a vase, grisal, signifying the primordial state, and a book, gradal or gradual, signifying the tradition. In certain versions of the legend of the Holy Grail, both meanings are closely united, as the book then becomes an inscription traced by Christ or by an angel on the chalice itself. Associations with the Book of Life and with certain elements of apocalyptic symbolism could easily be made here. It is not our intention to elaborate on any secondary details belonging to the legend of the Holy Grail, even though they all have a symbolic validity, nor to pursue the history of the Knights of the Round Table and their exploits, except to point out that the table was built by Arthur to Merlin's designs. and was intended to receive the Grail subsequent to its being recovered by one of the knights and brought back from Great Britain to Brittany. The table itself is one of those very ancient symbols always associated with the idea of spiritual centers, guardians of the tradition. The circular shape of the table is, moreover, formally linked to the zodiacal cycle by the presence around it of 12 principal persons. The Knights of the Round Table sometimes number 50, which was, for the Hebrews, the number of the Jubilee and which was also connected to the reign of the Holy Ghost. But even then, there were always 12 who play a preponderant role. In this connection, we must also remember the 12 peers of Charlemagne and other legendary tales of the Middle Ages. A characteristic which, as already noted, recurs in the constitution of all such centers. Another symbol connected to an aspect of the Grail legend and which merits attention is that of Mont Salvat, literally Mount of Salvation, its peak situated at the far horizons where no mortal can approach. It is depicted as being set in the midst of the sea in an inaccessible region behind which the sun rises. Mont Salvat is both the sacred isle and polar mountain, equivalent symbols that will be discussed in the course of this study. It is the land of immortality, equated naturally with the terrestrial paradise. The similarity between Mount Salvat and Mount Meru was pointed out to us by some Hindus, and this was what led us to examine more closely the significance of the Western legend of the Holy Grail. To return to the Grail itself, it is easy to see that its primary significance is basically the same as that which the sacred vase has everywhere it is found, which, especially in the East, was the sacrificial vessel, which originally contained the Vedic Soma, or Mazdian Heoma, the drought of immortality, that bestows upon or restores to the drinker who receives it, with the due rites, his sense of eternity. A completely separate study would be required to cover fully the symbolism of the chalice and its contents, but what has been said leads on to other questions of great importance to the argument which follows. Chapter 6. Melkizedek. Eastern tradition speaks of Soma being lost at a certain point in time, such that it became necessary for another beverage to be substituted for it, though it bore no relation to the original. According to the tradition of the Persians, there were two kinds of Heoma, a white one which could be gathered on the holy mountain, which they called Alborz, and a yellow one which took the place of the first one when the ancestors of the Iranians had left their primitive dwelling place, but which was also later lost. This concerns the successive phases of the spiritual darkening which occurs gradually throughout the different ages of the human cycle. The usual replacement was wine, to which a large part of the Greek legend of Dionysus is devoted. Dionysus, or Bacchus, has multiple names corresponding to as many different aspects. In one of these aspects, at least, tradition has it that he came from India. The tale according to which he was born from the thigh of Zeus rests on a most curious verbal assimilation. The Greek word meros, thigh, has been substituted for the name of Meru, the polar mountain, to which it is phonetically nearly identical. Moreover, wine is widely taken to represent the true initiatory tradition. The Hebraic ayin, wine, and sod, mystery, share the same number. The number of each of these words is 70, and were thus interchangeable. Wine symbolizes to the Sufi the esoteric knowledge reserved for the small elite and not suitable for all, as all cannot drink wine with impunity. Thus, the use of wine in a rite confers upon it a clearly initiatory character. Such is the case of the Eucharistic sacrifice of Melkizedek. The sacrifice of Melkizedek is usually regarded as a prefiguration of the Eucharist, and the Christian priesthood is in principle identified with the priesthood itself of Melkizedek, according to the application to Christ of the following words of the Psalms: Tu es sacerdos in aeternum secundum ordinum Melkizedek. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melkizedek. Psalms 110:4. Upon which we must now dwell a while. Melkizedek, or more properly Melki-Tsedeq, is none other than the title used by Judeo-Christian tradition to denote the function of the Lord of the world. We have hesitated before publishing this information, which explains one of the most enigmatic passages of the Hebrew Bible, but having decided to treat the issue of the Lord of the world, concluded it could hardly be passed over in silence. The words of St. Paul are most appropriate. We have much to say on this subject, and much that is difficult to explain, for you have become slow to understand. Epistle to the Hebrews 5:11. The biblical text prompting St. Paul's comment reads as follows: And Melkizedek, king of Salem, caused bread and wine to be brought, and he was priest to God the Most High, El Elyon. And he blessed Abraham, saying, the name Abram had then not yet changed to Abraham. At the same time, Genesis 17, the name of his wife, Sarai, was changed to Sarah, so that the numerological value of the two names together stayed the same. Saying, Blessed be Abraham, he of God the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God the Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And Abram gave him the tithe of all he had taken. Genesis 14:19-20. Melkizedek is thus both king and priest. His name means king of justice, and he is also king of Salem, that is, of peace. So again we find justice and peace, the fundamental attributes pertaining to the Lord of the world. Contrary to popular opinion, the name Salem has never described a town, but, taken as the symbol residence of Melkizedek, can be considered the equivalent of Agarttha. Nor can it be interpreted as the primitive name for Jerusalem, as the latter was originally called Jebus. On the contrary, had the name Jerusalem been given to the town and its establishment by the Jews as a spiritual center, it would have been to manifest it as an image of the true Salem. It is worth noting that the temple was built by Solomon, whose Hebraic name, Shlomo, also derived from Salem, Shalom, signifying peaceable. We should also note that the same root is found again in the word Islam and Muslim, Mohammedan. The submission to the divine will, this is the proper meaning of the word Islam, is the necessary condition for the peace. The idea expressed here should be likened to the Hindu Dharma. St. Paul comments as follows on the description given of Melkizedek. This Melkizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, when he returned from the defeat of the kings, came before Abraham, whom he blessed, and to whom Abraham gave the tithe of all his spoils, who is first, as his title denotes, King of Justice and also King of Salem, that is to say, King of Peace, who is without father, without mother, without origin, who has neither beginning nor end to his life, but who is made in the likeness of God's Son. This Melkizedek dwells as priest in perpetuity. Epistle to the Hebrews 7:1-3. Here Melkizedek, as the one giving the blessing, is represented as Abraham's superior. It cannot be gainsaid that the inferior is blessed by the superior. Hebrews 7:7. Abraham himself recognized this by surrendering the tithe, the mark of his dependence. The whole episode enacts a true investiture, almost in the feudal sense of the word, but with the difference that it is a spiritual investiture, wherein is found the exact point of union between the Hebraic and the great primordial tradition. The blessing is in fact the communication of a spiritual influence in which Abraham would henceforth participate, since the formula used placed him in a position of direct communication with God Most High, he whom Abraham afterwards invoked in the name of Jehovah. Genesis 14:22. If then Melki-Tsedeq is superior to Abraham, it is because his God Most High, Elyon, is superior to the all-powerful Shaddai, Abraham's God. Another view is that the first name represents a higher divine aspect than the second. On the other hand, a crucial truth that has never been noticed is that El Elyon is synonymous with Emmanuel, as each carry the same number. The number of each of these names is 197. This fact connects the history of Melkizedek directly with that of the Magi kings. Consequently, the priesthood of Melkizedek is that of El Elyon. The Christian priesthood is that of Emmanuel. If then El Elyon is Emmanuel, the two priesthoods are one, thus proving that the Christian office, with its Eucharistic offering of bread and wine, is truly according to the order of Melkizedek. This is the complete justification of the identity we indicated earlier. It should, however, be observed that participation in the tradition may not always be conscious. In this case it is, for all that, not less real as a means for transmission of the spiritual influences, but does not imply effective accession to any rank of the initiatory hierarchy. Judeo-Christian tradition distinguishes between two forms of priesthood, the one according to the order of Aaron, the other according to the order of Melkizedek. The latter is superior to the former, just as Melkizedek is superior to Abraham, whose issue composed the tribe of Levi, and consequently the family of Aaron. Following what proceeds, it can also be said that this superiority corresponds to that of the New Covenant over the ancient law. Epistle to the Hebrews 7:22. An explanation as to why the Christ was born into the royal tribe of Judah and not from the priestly tribe of Levi, see 7:11-17, would be opportune here, but these considerations would become too involved. The organization of the 12 tribes descending from the 12 sons of Jacob is naturally linked to the duodecimal constitution of spiritual centers. This supremacy is clearly defined by St. Paul. Levi collected the tithe from the people of Israel and paid it, so to speak, through Abraham. Epistle to the Hebrews 7:9. We shall not pursue here the question of the two priesthoods, but these other words of St. Paul are worth quoting. Here, in the Levitic priesthood, these are mortal men who receive the tithes, but there that is a man who is attested to be living. Hebrews 7:8. This living man who is Melkizedek is also Manu, he who lives perpetually, Hebrew Leolam, which means for the duration of his cycle, or Manvantara, or of the world he specifically controls. For this reason he is without genealogy, for his origin is non-human, since he is the veritable prototype of man. He is truly made like the Son of God. Through the prescription of his own law, he is for this world the expression and image of the divine Word. In the Pistis Sophia of the Alexandrine Gnostics, Melkizedek is qualified as great receiver of eternal light. This also fits the function of Manu, who in effect receives the intelligible light by a ray emanating from the principle to reflect it to the world, which is his domain. And besides, this is why Manu is called Son of the Sun. The history of the Magi Kings presents three distinct personages, the leaders of the initiatory hierarchy. The account of Melkizedek contains only one, but it is he who has the ability to unite in himself the necessary qualities of all three offices. Thus, some have distinguished Adonai-Zedek, Lord of Justice, who is also double in the form of Kohen-Zedek, Priest of Justice, and Melki-Tsedeq, King of Justice. These three can be taken as according to the function of the Brahmatma, the Mahatma, and the Mahanga. There exist still other traditions relating to Melkizedek. According to one of them, he was consecrated in the terrestrial paradise by the angel Michael at the age of 52. This symbolical number 52 plays, furthermore, an important role in the Hindu tradition, where it is considered as the total number of the meanings included in the Veda. It is even said that as many different pronunciations of the monosyllable Om correspond to those meanings. Strictly speaking, the title Melkizedek applies only to the last aspect, but as the function it expresses is the closest to the exterior world, and consequently the most immediately manifested, it is normally extended to embrace all three. Dharma Raja is the Indian equivalent of Melkizedek, but like Lord of the World and King of Justice, refers directly only to royal power. This name, or rather this title of Dharma Raja, is applied in particular to Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata, but it was first of all applied to Yama, the judge of the dead, whose very close connection with Manu has been indicated earlier. Taking the strict sense of the name Melkizedek as King of Justice, his proper attributes are the same scales and sword that characterize Michael, Angel of Judgment. In Christian iconography, the angel Michael figures with these two attributes in the representations of the Last Judgment. In the social structure, these emblems represent the administrative and military offices that properly belong to the Kshatriya caste, and which are the two elements of royal power. Hieroglyphically, they compose two characters to form the Arabic and Hebrew root hak, that denotes both justice and truth. Similarly, with the ancient Egyptians, Ma or Ma'at was at the same time justice and truth. One sees her figured on one of the pans of the scales of judgment, otherwise as a vase, hieroglyphic of the heart. In Hebrew, hak signifies decree, Psalms 2:7, and which served for many ancient races also to denote royalty. This word hak has the numerical value of 108, Cheth and Kaf, which is one of the fundamental cyclic numbers. In India, the Shaivite rosary is composed of 108 beads, and the primary significance of the rosary symbolizes the chain of the worlds, i.e., the causal chain of the cycles or existential states. Hak is the enabling power of justice, the equilibrium symbolized by the scales, whereas power is symbolized by the sword. This significance could be summarized in the following formula: force in the service of right, if modern usage had not misused it to excess by giving it a wholly external meaning. And it is that which truly characterizes royal power. In a spiritual sense, hak signifies the power of truth. A modified form of the word was formed by substituting the symbol for spiritual power for that of material strength, so that hak became hak or wisdom, Hebrew hakma, signifying sacerdotal authority rather than the royal power implied by hak. Both corresponding forms exist with similar meanings in the root khan, which signifies power or enablement, and also knowledge in a diversity of languages. Cf. L'Esotérisme de Dante, 1957 edition, page 58. Khan is essentially the same as the spiritual or intellectual power of wisdom, hence the Hebrew Kohen, priest, whereas Khan with a Kaf or Q is the material power from which originated many words denoting possession, notably the word Cain. The word Khan, a title given to chiefs by people of Central Asia, is perhaps connected with the same root. These roots could no doubt give rise to many other speculations which are, however, out of place here. The references contained in the Hebrew Kabbalah to the Shekinah will complete this subject. It is represented in the inferior world by Malkuth, which means kingdom, in which is the last of the 10 Sephiroth. This in itself is of relevance, but more so are the synonyms given to Malkuth of Zedek or the Just. Zedek is also the name of the planet Jupiter, whose angel is called Zadkiel Melech. The similitude with the name Melki-Tsedeq, to which is only added El, the divine name forming the common ending of all angelic names, is too evident here to need stressing. In India, the same planet is called Brihaspati, who is also the celestial pontiff. Another synonym of Malkuth is Sabbath, or Sabbath, whose sense of repose obviously refers to the idea of peace. All the more as this idea expresses, as we have seen earlier, the external aspect of the Shekinah herself, the aspect by which she links herself to the inferior world. This convergence of Malkuth and Zedek, or of royalty, the government of the world, and justice reappears in precisely the title Melkizedek. In this context, it represents the distributive and balanced justice found in the middle column of the Sephirothic tree. Here, this justice must be distinguished from that justice, opposed to mercy, which is identified with rigor in the left-hand column. Since these are two different aspects, and besides in Hebrew there are two words to distinguish these aspects, Zedekah and Din respectively, it is the first of these that denotes justice in both the strictest and most complete sense of the word, because it carries the fundamental idea or harmony and is indissolubly aligned with peace. Malkuth is the reservoir where the waters that flow from the river above unite. That is to say, all the emanations or spiritual influences or graces that are poured out so abundantly. P. Vuliad La Kabbale Juive, 1-509. This river from on high, and the waters that descend from it, strangely recall the role played in Hindu tradition by the celestial river Ganga. And one could also comment that Shakti, of which the Ganga is an aspect, is not without its similarities to the Shekinah, no doubt because of its providential function that is common to them both. This reservoir of celestial waters corresponds naturally to the spiritual center of our world, from which the 4 rivers of Pardes make their way towards the 4 cardinal points. The Jews identified the spiritual center as Mount Zion, calling it the heart of the world, in common with all holy lands. It corresponds to the Hindu Meru or Persian Alborz. With the Samaritans, it is the Mount Gerizim, which plays the same role and receives the same appellations. It is the Blessed Mountain, the Eternal Hill, the Mount of the Heritage, the House of God, and the Tabernacle of their angels, the dwelling place of the Shekinah. It is even identified with the primordial mountain, Har Kadim, where Eden was, and which was not submerged by the waters of the flood. The tabernacle of the holiness of Jehovah, the residence of the Shekinah, is the Saint of Saints, who is the heart of the temple. That is itself the center of Zion, Jerusalem, as the holy Sion, or Zion, is the center of the land of Israel, and as the land of Israel is the center of the world. P. Vuliad La Kabbale Juive, 1-509. The matter can be taken even further, not only by placing every name enumerated above in an inverse order, but also by adding, after the tabernacle and the temple, the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, and on the Ark itself, that point between the 2 cherubim where the Shekinah manifests, to represent successive approximations to the spiritual pole. Dante depicts Jerusalem as the spiritual pole in precisely this way, as explained elsewhere. But as soon as one leaves the strictly Judaic viewpoint, the center becomes symbolic and is not a location in the strict sense of the term. All secondary spiritual centers that are constituted with the aim of adapting primordial tradition to determined conditions are, as we have seen, images of the one supreme center. In fact, Sion can only be one of these subordinate centers, yet it is identified with the supreme center by reason of its resemblance. Jerusalem, as its name indicates, is an image of the genuine Salem, and what has been said and what will be said of the Holy Land, which is not merely the land of Israel, will make this attribution comprehensible. In this connection, another remarkable synonym of the Holy Land, land of the living, clearly describes the abode of immortality, in such a way that, strictly speaking, it is applicable to the terrestrial paradise, or its symbolic equivalents. However, this title has also been carried over to secondary centers, notably the land of Israel. It is said that the land of the living comprises 7 lands, about which Voliard observes that this land is Canaan, in which there were 7 peoples. La Kabbale Juive 2:116. Without doubt this is literally exact, but reviewed in a symbolical context, these 7 lands could equally well, like also those in the Islamic tradition, apply to the 7 Dvipas that, according to Hindu tradition, have Meru for a common center, to which we will return later. There is a striking resemblance, hardly accidental, between the eras of the 7 Manus, counted from the beginning of this Kalpa to the present epoch. A Kalpa comprises 14 Manvantaras. Vivaswata, the present Manu, is the 7th of this Kalpa, called Sri Sweta Varaha Kalpa, or Era of the White Boar. Another curious thing to remark is the following. The Jews give the appellation of Edom to Rome. Now tradition also speaks of 7 kings of Rome, and the second of these kings, Numa, who is considered legislator of the city, bears a name which is the exact syllabic reversal of Manu, and which can also at the same time be connected with the Greek nomos, law. There are therefore good grounds for believing that the 7 kings are, from a certain point of view, but a particular representation of the 7 Manus for a given civilization, as the 7 sages of Greece are. On the other hand, and in similar conditions, a representative of the 7 Rishis, in whom the wisdom of the cycle immediately preceding ours is synthesized, and the ancient worlds, or preceding creations, which are represented by the 7 kings of Edom. 7 in this context relates to the 7 days of Genesis. Chapter 7, Luz, or possibly Lux, but Luz, or the Abode of Immortality. Many races possess a tradition of an underground world. We do not intend to bring them all together here, as in any case, some of them have little direct relevance to our topic. Many races possess a tradition of an underground world. We do not intend to bring them all together here, as in any case, some of them have little direct relevance to our topic. However, generally speaking, the cult of the caverns is more or less conjoined with the idea of an interior or central place, and in any case, the symbol of the cave and that of the heart are very close. The cavern or the grotto represents the cavity of the heart, considered as the center of the being and also the interior of the egg of the world. On the other hand, there actually exists in Central Asia, America, and possibly elsewhere, caves and underground places where certain initiatory centers have been able to persist for centuries. It is not hard to disentangle one important symbolic fact from these stories. Indeed, the symbolical associations surrounding these centers indicate that a definite symbolic order, rather than simple prudence, determined the location of the underground centers. Saint Yves might perhaps have been able to explain this symbolism, but did not, which has given his work some overtones of fantasy. For example, the passage concerned with the descent to the hells. This may be compared with what I have said on the same subject in L'Esoterisme de Dante. As for Ossendowski, he was certainly incapable of reading any but the most obvious literal meaning into the symbolism attached to what he was told. Among the traditions referred to just now, there is one particular belonging to Judaism that carries a special significance. It concerns a mysterious town called Luz. The information given here has been partially drawn from the Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 8, page 219. This name was originally that of the place where Jacob dreamed his dream, and which he subsequently called Bethel, or House of God. Genesis 28:19. It is said that the angel of death was unable to enter this town and had no power over it. By an odd but significant convergence, some place it near to Alborz, which is, equally for the Persians, the abode of immortality. Near Luz there is purported to be an almond tree, also Luz in Hebrew, at the base of which a hollow leads to an underground passage. The traditions of certain peoples of North America also tell of a tree by means of which the men who originally lived in the interior of the earth reached the surface, whereas other men of the same race remained in the underground world. It is likely that Bulwer Lytton was inspired by these traditions in The Coming Race. A newer edition bears the title, The Race Which Will Exterminate Us. That gives on to the town, which itself is completely hidden. In its many guises, the word Luz or Luz appears to be derived from a root form denoting everything that is covered, concealed, enveloped, silent, and secret. It is interesting to note that the words describing the heavens had originally the same meaning. Usually, koelum is equated with the Greek koilon, or hollow, which Varro indicates in his A Cavo Coelum to be more closely connected with cavern than is popularly supposed. However, the most ancient, original, and most accurate form is judged to be kalum, or kaelum, a word very near to the word kalar, to hide, or salar. In Sanskrit, too, Varuna is born out of var, to cover. This is precisely the meaning of the word kal, which is related to the Latin salar, or salare, another form of salar, and to its Greek synonym, kaluptian. Other Latin words derive from the same root kal, such as caligo and perhaps the compound occultus. On the other hand, it is possible that the form kalar or salar originated from a different root, saed or kaed, with the meaning to cut or divide, from which also kader, or seder, and subsequently separate and hide. But in any case, the ideas expressed by these roots are, as can be seen, very close to one another, which could easily have caused the assimilation of salar and salar, even if these two forms are etymologically independent. The Greek uranos is nothing but another form of the same word, var, changing easily to ur. These words, then, can signify that which covers. The roof of the world, which can be likened to the celestial world, or world of the living, has in the traditions of Central Asia close connections with the western sky, where reigns Avalokiteshvara. Concerning the sense of covering, the Masonic expression to be covered must be recalled. The star-covered ceiling of the lodge represents the vault of heaven. That which conceals, it is the veil of Ma or of Neith of the Egyptians, the blue veil of the Universal Mother in the Far Eastern traditions, Tao Te Ching, chapter 6. If one applies this meaning to the visible sky, one can find therein an allusion to the role of astronomical symbolism, hiding or revealing superior truths. And that which is hidden. The last has the double meaning of that which is concealed from the senses in the suprasensitive realm, and that which during periods of darkness or occlusion ceases to be an openly manifested tradition, so that the celestial world becomes the underground world. There is still another connection to be made with heaven. Luz is called the Blue City, and blue, the color of sapphire, The sapphire plays an important role in biblical symbolism. In particular, it frequently appears in the visions of prophets. It is known as the celestial color. In India, it is said that the blue color of the atmosphere is produced by the reflection of light on the meridional face of Meru, the face that looks upon the Jambu Dwipa, and is made of sapphire. Obviously, this is the same symbolism. The Jambu Dwipa represents not only India, as usually thought, but represents the whole terrestrial world in its present condition. This world can therefore be seen as being situated entirely to the south of Meru, since the latter is identified with the North Pole. In Sanskrit, the north is called Uttara, i.e. the highest region. The south is called Dakshina, the region to the right, i.e. the one which is on one's right in turning to the east. The ascending march of the sun towards the north, beginning with the winter solstice and terminating at the summer solstice, is called Uttarayana. The descending march of the sun towards the south, beginning with the summer solstice and ending at the winter solstice, is called Dakshinayana. The 7 Dwipas, literally islands or continents, emerge successively during the course of certain cyclic periods, so that each is the terrestrial world in its corresponding period. They form a lotus shape and are oriented towards its center, Meru, in accordance with the 7 regions of space. In Hindu symbolism, which Buddhism has retained in the legend of the 7 steps, the 7 regions of space are the 4 cardinal points, plus the zenith and the nadir, and then the center itself. Note that their representation forms a cross in 3 dimensions, 6 directions opposed 2 by 2 starting from the center. Similarly, in Kabbalistic symbolism, the holy palace or interior palace is in the center of 6 directions, thus forming the septenary. And Clement of Alexandria says that from God, heart of the universe, spread the vast stretches directed one upwards, one downwards, this one to the right, that one to the left, one forwards and the other one backwards, directing his gaze towards these 6 stretches as towards an always equal number. See Chapter 2, Note 19. Translators. He completes the world. He is the beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega. In him the 6 phases of time complete themselves, and it is from him they receive their indefinite extension. There is the secret of the number 7, quoted by P. Vouliard in La Kabbale Juive, 1, 215 through 216. All this is related to the development of the primordial point in space and time. The 6 phases of time, corresponding to the 6 directions of space respectively, are 6 cyclic periods, subdivisions of another, more general period, and sometimes symbolically represented as 6 millennia. They can also be likened to the 6 days of Genesis, the 7th or Sabbath, being the phase of return to the principle, i.e. to the center. We thus have 7 periods to which can be related the respective manifestations of the 7 Dwipas. If each of these periods is a Manvantara, the Kalpa comprises 2 complete septenary periods. It is, moreover, understood that the same symbolism is applicable to different degrees, according to whether more or less extended cyclic periods are envisaged. Therefore, one face of Meru is turned towards each of the 7 Dwipas, each of which reflects one of the colors of the rainbow. The overall synthesis of these colors is white, which is universally attributed to supreme spiritual authority. It is therefore not without reason that the Pope is dressed in white in the Catholic hierarchy, and which is the color of Meru taken as a unity. It will be seen later on that Meru is in fact called the White Mountain. White thus distinguishes the intrinsic Meru from its other faces that only represent its aspects in relation to the Dwipas. It would appear that the Meru assumes a different position for each period of manifestation by a Dwipa, but in fact the center Meru remains immovable, and it is the orientation of the terrestrial world dependent on it which changes from one period to the next. To return to the Hebrew word luz, whose many different meanings merit careful study, in the ordinary sense it means almond, by extension almond tree, and also kernel. Now this kernel is the innermost, the most hidden part, and is completely enclosed, so giving rise to the idea of inviolability. This is why the almond tree has been taken as the symbol of the Virgin. That is found also in the name Agarttha, but it is also the name given to a specific indestructible body, symbolically represented by an extremely hard bone, to which the body after death remains attached until its resurrection. It is perhaps of interest to note that this Judaic tradition probably inspired certain theories of Leibniz about the animal, i.e. the living being, as perpetually subsisting with a body but miniaturized after death. As the kernel contains the germ and as the bone contains the marrow, so luz contains those elements necessary for the restoration of an individual being. And this restoration will operate under the influence of a celestial dew, to revivify the dry bones. St. Paul describes the process most graphically. Sown in corruption, he will be resuscitated in glory. First Epistle to the Corinthians 15:42. A strict application of the law of analogy can be found in these words. What is above is like what is below, but upside down. Here, as elsewhere, glory tallies with the Shekinah envisaged in this superior world, and with which the celestial dew has a close relationship, as has been brought out in a preceding chapter. The luz being imperishable. In Sanskrit, the word akshara signifies indissoluble and hence imperishable or indestructible. It designates the syllable, first element in germ of language, and is preeminently applicable to the monosyllable Om, which is said to contain in itself the essence of the triple Veda. Is in the human world the kernel of immortality, as the place of the same name is the Abode of Immortality. There stops in both cases the power of the angel of death. It is like a kind of egg or embryo of the immortal. The equivalent in another form is found in the various traditions, and particularly with very important developments in Taoism. In this respect it is, in the microcosmic order, the parallel of what the egg of the world is in the macrocosmic order, as it contains the possibilities of the future cycle, the Vita Venturi Seculi of the Catholic Credo. It can also be compared to the chrysalis from which the butterfly emerges. Here, reference can be made to the Greek symbolism of Psyche, which rests for a great part on this simile. See Psyche by F. Prawn. A parallel that exactly conveys its role in relation to the resurrection. The luz is conventionally sighted towards the base of the spinal column. This might seem odd, but is clarified by reference to what the Hindu tradition says about the power called Kundalini. The word Kundali, feminine Kundalini, signifies rolled up in the shape of a ring or spiral. This rolled up condition signifies an embryonic state or an undeveloped state, which is a form of Shakti, considered to be immanent in the human being. In this respect and in a certain connection, its dwelling is also identified with the cavity of the heart. We have already referred to the relationship existing between the Hindu Shakti and the Hebraic Shekinah. This power is represented by a coiled-up snake, in a part of the subtle body corresponding precisely with the base of the spinal column. At least this is how it is in ordinary man, but by means of techniques such as those of Hatha Yoga, she is aroused, moves, and rises through the wheels, or chakras, or lotuses, kamalas, which correspond to the various plexuses, to reach the region of the third eye, the frontal eye of Shiva. This stage represents the restoration of the primordial state, where man recovers his sense of eternity. and through that attains what we have elsewhere called virtual immortality. Until this point, we are still in the human state. In the next phase, the Kundalini finally reaches the crown of the head. This is the Brahma Randra, orifice of Brahma, point of contact of the Sushumna, or coronal artery, with the solar ray. This symbolism is discussed in detail in Man and His Becoming according to Vedanta. In this stage represents the effective conquest of the higher states of being. What seems to come out of this comparison is that the given position of the luz in the lower part of the body only refers to its state in fallen man, and for earthly humanity considered as a whole, it compares to the location of the supreme spiritual center in the underground world. All this has a very close connection with the true significance of the well-known Hermetic saying, Visita inferiora terrae, rectificando invenis occultum lapidum, virum medicinum, which gives by acrostic the word vitriolum. The philosopher's stone is at the same time, under another aspect, the true medicine, i.e. the elixir of long life, which is nothing other than the drink of immortality. Interiora is sometimes written instead of inferiora, but this does not alter the general meaning, and there always remains the same manifest allusion to the underground world. Chapter 8. The Supreme Center Concealed During the Kali Yuga. Agarttha, it is said, did not always exist underground and will not always remain so. A time will come again when, according to Ossendowski's report, the people of Agarthi will come out of their caves and appear on the surface of the earth. These are the final words of a prophecy that the Lord of the World is said to have made in 1890 when he appeared at the monastery of Narabanchi. Before its disappearance from the visible world, the center bore another name, since Agartha, which means ungraspable or inaccessible, and also inviolable as it is Salem, the abode of peace, would not yet have become appropriate. Ossendowski dates its withdrawal underground as more than 6,000 years ago, which turns out, given a reasonable approximation, to correspond to the beginning of the Kali Yuga, or Black Age, the Iron Age of the ancient West, which is the last of the 4 periods into which the Manvantara is divided. The Manvantara, or era of a Manu, also called Mahayuga, comprises 4 yugas or secondary periods: Krita Yuga or Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, which are identifiable with the Age of Gold, the Age of Silver, the Age of Bronze, and the Age of Iron, respectively, of the Greco-Latin antiquity. In the succession of these periods, there is a kind of progressive materialization resulting from the gradual distancing from the principle which necessarily accompanies the development of the cyclic manifestation in the corporeal world, starting from the primordial state. Its reappearance should therefore coincide with the ending of this same period. Reference has already been made to something that is lost or hidden, reported in all traditions, and which is represented by different symbols. In a general sense, this loss tallies exactly with the conditions of humanity during the Kali Yuga. The current period is one of occlusion and confusion. The beginning of this age in biblical symbolism, represented by the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues. One could quite logically think that the fall and the flood correspond to the end of the first 2 ages, but in reality, the starting point of the Hebraic tradition does not correspond to the beginning of the Manvantara. It must not be forgotten that the cyclic laws apply to different degrees, for periods not of the same extent, which also sometimes encroach on one another. Hence, the complications which at first sight may seem inextricable, and which can in effect be resolved only by considering the order of hierarchic subordination of the corresponding traditional centers. So, the current period is one of occlusion and confusion. Its conditions are such that the initiatory knowledge must remain hidden for as long as they endure. hence the nature of the mysteries of historical antiquity, which does not even reach back to the beginning of this period. It appears that notice has never been properly taken of the fact that historians find it practically impossible in almost all cultures to establish an unquestionable chronology for everything anterior to the 6th century before the Christian era, and the secret societies of all peoples. Such organizations provide an effective initiation only where an authentic traditional doctrine still exists, offering but a shadow when the spirit of the doctrine no longer vivifies the symbols that are merely its external representation. This happens when, for different reasons, the conscious connection with the supreme spiritual center of the world is finally broken. This loss of a direct and effective link with the supreme center is the most significant aspect of the loss of a tradition, and that which particularly affects secondary or dependent centers. It is important to realize that we should be talking of something that is hidden rather than truly lost, because it is not lost to everybody but still possessed in its entirety, albeit by a very few. This gives rise, of course, to the possibility for others to rediscover it, provided they search in the proper manner, which is to say that their intention must be directed in such a way that, through the harmonious vibrations it awakens, it enables an effective spiritual communication to be made with the Supreme Center. What we have just said allows us to interpret the following words of the Gospels in a very precise sense. Seek and ye shall find, ask and ye will receive, knock and it will be opened to you. Here one must naturally refer to the indications we have already given concerning the right intention and goodwill, the explanation of the expression pax in terra hominibus bone voluntatis, peace on earth to men of good will, is easily seen in this context. Through the law of concordant actions and reactions. This expression has been borrowed from the Taoist doctrine. In addition, we here understand the word intention in a sense very exactly that of the Arabic niyah, which is usually translated thus, and this moreover confirms to the Latin etymology, from intendere, tending towards. In all traditional forms, this right intention is always symbolically represented generally by a ritual orientation, properly directed towards some spiritual center, that, whatever it may be, is always but a reflection of the true center of the world. In Islam, this orientation, Qibla, is, as it were, the materialization, if we may use this expression, of intention, niyah. The orientation of Christian churches is another particular case which is essentially connected to the same idea. However, the further the Kali Yuga progresses, the more difficult it becomes to attain unity with this center, which in its turn becomes more and more closed and concealed. At the same time, those secondary centers that represent it externally become rarer. Only a relative exteriorization is of course meant, as these secondary centers have themselves been more or less strictly closed since the beginning of the Kali Yuga. Yet when this period finishes, the tradition will of necessity be manifested again in its entirety, for the beginning of each Manvantara coincides with the end of the preceding one, thus implying the inevitable return of the primordial state for humanity on earth. This is the manifestation of the celestial Jerusalem, which is, in connection with the cycle which is ending, the same thing as is the terrestrial paradise in connection with the cycle which is beginning, as explained in Le Esoterisme de Dante. The first of these breaks occurred at the beginning of the 14th century, at which time one of the principal roles of the orders of chivalry was to make a direct connection between East and West. The importance of such a link will be readily understood when it is recalled that the center has always, at least in historical times, been depicted as being situated in the Orient. After the destruction of the Order of the Templars, the liaison was maintained in a less overt fashion by the Rosicrucians, or those to whom this name was afterwards given. Here again we must refer to our study L'Esoterisme de Dante, where we have given all the necessary supporting information. The Renaissance and the Reformation marked another critical phase after which, as St. Yves appears to suggest, the complete and final rupture coincided with the treaties of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in 1648. It is a remarkable fact that several writers have agreed that the true Rosicrucians left Europe shortly after the 30 Years' War to retire into Asia. It may be recalled that the Rosicrucian adepts numbered 12, like the members of Agartha's inner circle. Both, therefore, complied with the constitution common to so many other spiritual centers formed in the image of the Supreme Center. Since that last period, the store of effective initiatory knowledge has not been truly kept by any Western organization. According to Swedenborg, the lost word must henceforth be sought among the sages of Tibet and of Tartary, where the mysterious Mount of Prophets of Anne Catherine Emmert's vision is also set. The fragmentary information that Madame Blavatsky was able to gather on this subject, without fully understanding its true significance, gave birth to her conception of the Great White Lodge, which we should not call an image, but quite simply a caricature or imaginary parody of Agartha. To those who understand the considerations set forth here, will see as a clear consequence why we cannot possibly take seriously the many pseudo-initiatory organizations born in the contemporary West. Not one of them, if subjected to a rather rigorous examination, could provide the slightest proof of regularity. Chapter 9. The Omphalos and the Sacred Stones. According to Ossendowski's report, the Lord of the World formerly appeared several times in India and in Siam, blessing the people with a golden apple surmounted with a lamb. This is an extremely important detail when it is compared with St. Yves's description of the cycle of the lamb and the ram. We should be reminded here of the allusion already made elsewhere to the connection that exists between the Vedic Agni or Agni and the symbol of the lamb. L'Esoterisme de Dante, 1957 edition, pages 69 through 70. And Man and His Becoming according to Vedanta, page 44. In India, the ram represents the vehicle of Agni. Furthermore, Mr. Ossendowski points out on several occasions that the cult of Rama still exists in Mongolia. Hence, there is something more than Buddhism there, contrary to what most of the Orientalists maintain. From another side, we have had communications about the memories of the cycle of Ram, which are said to still subsist in Cambodia, giving information which appeared so extraordinary that we have preferred not to remark on it. We therefore mention it only as a reminder. It is even more remarkable that there exist in Christian symbolism innumerable representations of the Lamb on a mountain from which flow down 4 rivers that are clearly identical with those 4 rivers of terrestrial paradise. Note also the representation of the Lamb on the book sealed by 7 seals mentioned in the Apocalypse. Tibetan Lamaism also possesses 7 mysterious seals, and we doubt if this connection is purely accidental. As already mentioned, Agartha possessed a different name before the onset of the Kali Yuga. It was called Paradesha, which in Sanskrit means supreme country, and which applies well to the spiritual center par excellence, also called the heart of the world. It is the word from which the Chaldeans formed Pardes, and Westerners paradise. Such is the original sense of this last word, which should make it clear why, in one form or another, it always signifies the same thing as the Pardes of the Hebrew Kabbalah. On summing up what has been discussed about the symbolism of the pole, it is not difficult to understand that the mountain of terrestrial paradise is the same as the polar mountain. Almost every tradition has its name for this mountain, such as the Hindu Meru, the Persian Alborz, and the Mont Salvat of Western Grail legend. There is also the Arab mountain Kaf. It is said of the mountain Kaf that it can be attained neither by land nor by sea. La Bilbar wa la Bilbar, cf. what was said earlier of Mont Salvat, and it has among its other designations that of the Mountain of the Saints, Jabal el Awliya, to be connected to the Mountain of the Prophets of Anne Catherine Emmerich, and the Greek Olympus, which has in many ways the same significance. This consists of a region that, like the terrestrial paradise, has become inaccessible to ordinary humanity, and that is beyond the reach of those cataclysms which upset the human world at the end of certain cyclic periods. This region is the authentic supreme country, which, according to certain Vedic and Avestan texts, was originally sited towards the North Pole, even in the literal sense of the word, although it may change its localization according to the different phases of human history. It still remains polar in a symbolic sense, because essentially it represents the fixed axis around which everything revolves. Before the advent of the Kali Yuga, the mountain naturally figured as the center of the world. That is to say, it existed somewhat openly, and had not yet gone underground. Accordingly, this corresponds to what one may call a normal period, and was outside those special conditions imposed by an occluded period wherein a sort of reversal of established order is imposed. It must be added that apart from the considerations of cyclical laws, the symbols of the mountain and the cave have each their own reason for being and are truly complementary. This complementarity is that of two triangles placed inversely towards one another, which form the Seal of Solomon. It can also be compared to that of the spear and of the cup mentioned earlier, and to many other equivalent symbols. In addition, the cavern may be envisaged as being situated inside the mountain itself or immediately beneath it. There are certain other symbols in ancient traditions which represent the center of the world, one of the most remarkable and widely spread of which is that of the Omphalos. In a book called Omphalos, which appeared in 1913, W.H. Roscher has assembled a considerable quantity of documents establishing this fact for all manner of peoples. But he is wrong to maintain that this symbol is linked to these people's idea of the shape of the Earth's surface. He imagined it to be the belief in a center of the Earth's surface in the most grossly literal sense, which opinion implies a complete ignorance of the deep significance of the symbolism. In what follows, we will utilize certain information from a work by J. Loth on l'Omphalos chez les Celtes, published in La Revue des Études Anciennes, July through September 1915. In Greek, the word signifies umbilical, but in a general sense describes everything that is central and in particular the hub of a wheel. The Sanskrit nabi has the same connotations, as do various words in the Germanic and Celtic languages derived from the same root, found in the forms knob and nav. In German, nabe, hub, and nabel, navel, similarity in English, nave and navel, this last word also having the general meaning of center or middle. The Greek omphalos and the Latin umbilicus come from a simple modification of the same root. In Gaelic, nav or naf, which is plainly identical with these, carries the sense of chief and is even applied to God. So it is indeed the idea of a central principle that is being expressed. In the Rig Veda, Agni is called the navel of the world, which is again linked to the same idea. The swastika is often, as we have already mentioned, a symbol of Agni. The meaning of hub is particularly important to this issue as the wheel universally symbolizes the world rotating around a fixed point, a symbolism also associated with the swastika. In the latter, however, the circumference is not delineated in order to give an immediate indication of the center. The swastika is not an image of the world, but of the action of the principle in relation to the world. The symbol of the Omphalos could be placed in a position that was simply the center of a particular area. The spiritual center, of course, rather than the geographical one, although in certain cases these might coincide. If the latter was the case, the place was indeed, for the people who inhabited the region in question, the physical image of the center of the world, in the same way as their own tradition was an adaptation of the primordial tradition expressed in a form that suited best their mentality and conditions of existence. The best known Omphalos is one in the temple at Delphi, the temple that was the genuine spiritual center for all ancient Greece. There were other spiritual centers in Greece, but more particularly reserved to initiation in the mysteries, like Eleusis and Samothrace, whereas Delphi had a social role concerned directly with the totality of the Hellenic collectivity. Without enumerating all the reasons for making this assertion, it should be noted that there assembled twice yearly at Delphi the Council of Amphictyons, which consisted of representatives from all the Hellenic peoples and which in fact provided the only effective link between these peoples. The strength of this bond lay in its essentially traditional character. The material representation of the Omphalos usually consisted of a sacred stone, commonly called in French a betel, a word apparently none other than the Hebrew Bethel, or house of God. A betel is a stone believed to be the dwelling place of the deity, i.e., rather more than a sacred stone. There is no English equivalent. Translators. This name was the name given by Jacob to the place where the Lord manifested himself to him in a dream. And Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not." And he was afeared and said, "How awesome is this place! It is the house of God and the door to heaven." And Jacob arose early in the morning and took with him the stone on which he had laid his head, made it into a pillar, and poured oil over it to consecrate it. And he named this place Bethel, or Bethel. But the first name of this place was Luz. Genesis 27:16-19. It is said that Bethel, or Bethel, the house of God, subsequently became Bethlehem, house of bread, the town where Christ was born. The phonetic similarity between Bethlehem and the form Beth Elohim, which also figures in the text of Genesis, should be noted. The symbolic relationship existing between stone and bread is always worth examining. And the tempter approaching said to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." St. Matthew 4:3 and St. Luke 4:3. These words have a mysterious meaning connected with what we indicate here. Christ did indeed have to accomplish such a transformation, but spiritually, not materially, as asked of him by the tempter. Now the spiritual order is analogous to the material order, but upside down. And the mark of the demon is to take everything backwards. It is Christ himself who, as manifestation of the Word, is the living bread descended from heaven, whence the answer, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word issuing from the mouth of God. This is the bread which in the new covenant had to be substituted for the stone, as house of God. And let us add, furthermore, this is why the oracles have ceased. In connection with this bread, which is identified with the flesh of the manifested Word, it may be of interest to note in addition that the Arab word lam, which is the same as the Hebrew lahem, does precisely signify flesh and not bread. And it should be made clear that Bethel applies not only to the place but to the stone itself. And this stone that I have raised as a pillar will be the house of God. Genesis 28:22. Thus, this stone must be the true divine habitation, Mishkan, the seat of the Shekinah, although the designation was later transferred to the tabernacle. All this relates naturally to the subject of spiritual influences, Barakoth, so that when the cult of stones, common to so many ancient peoples, is mentioned, it can be seen at once that it was not the stones themselves that were worshipped, but the divinity residing in them. The stone representing the Omphalos could take the form of a pillar like Jacob's. It is very likely that some of the menhirs of the Celts had the same significance. Oracles were uttered in association with them, as at Delphi, which is easily understood if it is seen that they were the abode of divinity. The house of God is naturally identifiable with the center of the world. The Omphalos could also have been represented, like the black stone of Cybele, by a conical shape where the cone represents the sacred mountain, symbol of the pole or axis of the world. Another version was an ovoid, which would bring it into direct relationship with another extremely important symbol, the egg of the world. Sometimes, and notably on certain Greek omphaloi, the stone was encircled by a serpent. This serpent can be seen coiled at the base or at the summit of certain Chaldean boundary stones, which should be considered to be real betyls. Moreover, the symbol of the stone, as that of the tree, another figure of the axis of the world, is in a general way in close connection with the symbol of the serpent. It is equally so for the symbol of the egg, notably with the Celts and the Egyptians. A remarkable example of the representation of the Omphalos is the sacred stone of Kermaria, the general shape of which is that of an irregular cone, rounded at the top, and one of its faces bearing the sign of the swastika. J. Loth, in the work mentioned earlier, has given photographs of this betyl, as well as of other stones of the same kind. While the Omphalos was usually depicted by a stone, it sometimes took the form of a mound or sort of tumulus, again an image of the sacred mountain. In China, for example, a mound or a hillock in the shape of a quadrangular pyramid was built in the center of every kingdom or feudal state, made out of earth brought from the 5 regions. Its 4 sides correspond to the 4 cardinal points, and its summit to the center itself. Strangely enough, the number 5 has a quite special symbolic significance in the Chinese tradition. Strangely enough, these 5 regions were also to be found in Ireland, where the chief's standing stone was in a similar way erected in the middle of each domain. Brehon Laws, cited by J. Loth. Among Celtic nations, it is Ireland that provides the most data about the Omphalos. The country was formerly divided into 5 kingdoms, one of which was called Mide, or Mide, nowadays anglicized as Meath, from the ancient Celtic word medion, or middle, identical to the Latin medius. Note that China is also designated as Middle Empire. The kingdom of Mide, or Mide, has been formed by deducting portions of land from other 4 kingdoms and became, through prerogative, the property of Ireland's supreme king, to whom the other monarchs were subordinate. The capital of the kingdom of Mide, or Mide, was Tara. Now, in Sanskrit, the word Tara means star and designates more particularly the North Star. There was a gigantic stone at Uisneach, current Gaelic spelling, translators, the exact center of the country, called both the navel of the earth and stone of portions, El Na Miran, because it marked the place where the dividing boundaries of the 4 older kingdoms converged inside the kingdom of Mide. There, a general assembly was held annually on the 1st of May. That was very like the annual reunion of the Druids at their consecrated place. Medio Lenon, or Medio Nemeton in Gaul, in the country of the Carnutes. The similarity with the assembly of the Amphictyons at Delphi is clear. Ireland's division into 4 kingdoms, plus its central region where the supreme ruler resided, was a legacy of very ancient tradition. It was this arrangement that caused Ireland to be named the Island of the Four Masters. The name of St. Patrick, which is usually known only in its Latinized form, was originally Cathraige, which signifies the servant of the four. Though this title and its synonym, Green Isle or Erin, had originally been used to denote another, much more northerly land called Ogygia, or rather Thule or Thule, now unknown, perhaps vanished, which was once one of the principal spiritual centers, if not, during a certain cycle, the Supreme One. The memory of this island of four masters is also to be found, although previously unnoticed, in the Chinese tradition contained in a Taoist text. The Emperor Yao took a great deal of trouble and sincerely believed he had reigned in an ideal way. However, after his visit to the Four Masters on the distant island of Kushi, inhabited by real men, Chenjen, those who have been restored to their primordial state, he realized that he had spoiled everything. The ideal, he discovered, consists of the indifference, or rather the detachment in action, that is, non-action of the superior man. The true man, being positioned in the center, no longer participates in the movement of things, but in reality he directs this movement by his very presence, because the activity of heaven is reflected in him, who allows the cosmic wheel to turn. Shengzu, Chapter 1, translated into French by Father L. Uyghur, page 213. It is said that the Emperor Yao reigned in the year 2356 BC. In another interpretation, the four masters are identified with the four Maharajas, or great kings, who, in Indian and Tibetan traditions, preside at the four cardinal points. One could also make a connection with the four Autad of Islamic esotericism. They correspond at the same time to the elements. The Supreme Master, the fifth, who resides in the center on the sacred mountain, represents the ether, Akasha, the quintessence or quinta essentia of the Hermeticists, which is the primordial element from which proceed the other four. In cross-shaped figures, such as the swastika, this primordial element is also represented by the central point, which is the pole. The four other elements, as well as the four cardinal points, correspond to the four branches of the cross, symbolizing, moreover, fourfoldness in all of its applications. Analogous traditions are to be found in Central America. Chapter 10, Names and Symbolic Representations of Spiritual Centers. Many other traditions accord with all that has been discussed about the Supreme Country. There is notably another name for it that is probably even older than Paradesha. This name is Tula, which the Greeks called Thule, or Thule, a name which we have already understood to be apparently the true equivalent of the Isle of the Four Masters. The name has, however, been given to many different regions, so that even today it is still to be found as far afield as Russia and Central America. No doubt each of these regions constituted the seat of a spiritual power in some era more or less long past, and which was an emanation of the power of the primordial Tula. It is known that the Mexican Tula owes its origin to the Toltecs, who came, it is said, from Aztlan, the land in the middle of the water, which is, evidently, Atlantis. They brought the name Tula from their country of origin and gave it to a center which consequently must have replaced, to a certain extent, that of the lost continent. The ideographic sign of Aztlan, or of Tula, was the white heron. In the West, the heron and the stork play the same roles as the ibis in the East, and these three birds figure among the emblems of Christ. For the Egyptians, the ibis was one of the symbols of Thoth, i.e. of wisdom. On the other hand, the Atlantean Tula must be distinguished from the Hyperborean Tula, which later represents the first and supreme center for the entire current Manvantara, and is the archetypal sacred isle, situated, as we have seen, in a literally polar location. All the other sacred isles, although everywhere bearing names of equivalent meaning, are still only images of the original. This even applies to the spiritual center of Atlantean tradition, which only governed a secondary historical cycle subordinate to the Manvantara. The great difficulty in precisely determining the meeting point of the Atlantean and the Hyperborean traditions comes from certain substitutions of names which can cause multiple confusions. But the question is nevertheless perhaps not entirely insoluble. In Sanskrit, the word Tula means balance or scales and specifically denotes the zodiacal sign of Libra. However, there is a Chinese tradition in which the heavenly balance was originally the Great Bear. The Great Bear is even said to have been called the scale of jade, jade being a symbol of perfection. With other people, the Great Bear and the Little Bear have been compared to the two pans of a scale. This symbolic scale is not without connection with the scale referred to in the Sephira de Zeniutha, or the Book of Mysteries in the Zohar section. The latter is suspended in a place which is not, i.e. in the non-manifested, represented for our world by the polar point. One can, moreover, say that the equilibrium of the world effectively rests on the pole. This point is very important as the symbolism connected with the Great Bear is naturally connected in the closest possible way to that of the pole. In India, the Great Bear is the Sapta Riksha, i.e. the symbolic dwelling of the 7 rishis. This naturally conforms with the Hyperborean tradition, whereas in the tradition of Atlantis, the Pleiades, which are also formed of 7 stars, take the place of the Great Bear in this role. Besides, it is known that for the Greeks, the Pleiades were the daughters of Atlas, and as such also called Atlantides. This subject could usefully be pursued further than is possible here. It is also interesting to note that in connection with what we have said earlier concerning the phonetic comparison between Meru and Meros, the ancient Egyptians called the Great Bear the constellation of the Thigh, as Kenneth Grant notes so many times. However, it is worth looking at the relationship that may exist between the polar scales and the zodiacal balance. Libra of the zodiac is regarded as the sign of judgment, and as we have noted, apropos of Melkizedek, an attribute of justice, so that it can be seen that its name was the designation of the supreme spiritual center. Tula is, in addition, called the White Island, the color, as we have seen, representing spiritual authority. In the American traditions, Aztlan is symbolized by a white mountain, although this applied originally to the Hyperborean Tula and the Polar Mountain. In India, the White Isle, Shweta-Dwipa, commonly considered to be set in the remote regions of the north. Shweta-Dwipa is one of the 18 subdivisions of Jambu-Dwipa, or Jambu-Dvipa, is regarded as the abode of the blessed, a name easily identifiable as the land of the living. This can also bring to mind the Fortunate Isles of Western antiquity, but these islands were situated to the west, the Garden of the Hesperides. Hesper in Greek, Vesper in Latin, are the evening, i.e. the west, which indicates a tradition of Atlantean origin, and which can also, on the other hand, remind us of the western sky of Tibetan tradition. There is, however, an apparent exception in that Celtic traditions describe a green isle as being the Isle of Saints or Isle of the Blessed. The name Island of the Saints has been subsequently given to Ireland as well as Green Isle and even to England. Note that the name of the island, Heligoland, also has the same significance. But still, the White Mountain, its summit purple, Here, the three hermetic colors, green, white, and red, of which we spoke in Le Esoterisme de Dante, are met again. Stands in the center, never submerged by any flood. Similar traditions concerning the earthly paradise have already been pointed out. In Islamic esotericism, the green island, El Jizra El Khadra, and the white mountain, El Jabal et Abiod, or Abiad, are also well known, although very little mentioned in public. This mountain of the sun, as it is also called, is the equivalent of Meru, also entitled White Mountain. Meru is encircled by a green belt by the fact of being situated in the middle of the sea. On the other hand, a rainbow-colored belt is sometimes mentioned, which can be compared with the scarf of Iris. Saint Yves refers to it in his Mission de l'Inde, that the same thing is found in the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich. Refer to what was said above about the symbolism of the rainbow, as well as about the 7 dweepas. And a triangle of light radiates at its peak. The designation of spiritual centers as white isles was applicable, like the others, to secondary centers and not only to the supreme center, their source. To these must be added the names of places, countries, and towns that express the idea of whiteness. These are frequent enough from Albion to Albania, through Alba Longa, the mother city of Rome. The Latin albus, white, is moreover to be connected to the Hebrew Laban, which has the same meaning and of which the feminine gender Labana, is used to designate the moon. In Latin, luna can signify white as well as luminous, both ideas being moreover connected. And the Greek town of Argos. Between the adjective Argos, white, and the name of the city, there is only a simple difference of accentuation. The same name in the masculine gender is that of Argus. This leads one to think of the ship Argo, which was, moreover, said to have been constructed by Argus, and whose mast was made of oak tree from the forest of Dodona. In this case, the word could also signify rapid, rapidity being considered an attribution of light, and especially of lightning. But the first meaning is whiteness, and then luminosity. Silver, which is the white metal and which corresponds astrologically to the moon, derives from the same word. The Latin argentum and the Greek argyros, or argyros, have obviously an identical root. The reason for these things will be clarified shortly. An additional comment is called for on the representation of a spiritual center as an island containing a sacred mountain. For while such a locality may have had a tangible existence, even though not all holy lands were islands, there should also be a symbolic meaning. Historical facts, especially those pertaining to sacred history, translate in their own way truths of a higher order, owing to the law of correspondence, which is the foundation of symbolism, and which unites all the worlds in total and universal harmony. This idea evoking the representation under discussion is essentially one of stability that is itself a characteristic of the pole. The island remains immovable amidst the ceaseless agitation of the waves, a disturbance that reflects that of the external world. Accordingly, it is necessary to cross the sea of passions in order to reach the Mount of Salvation, the sanctuary of peace. The yogi, having crossed the sea of passions, is united with tranquility and possesses the self in its plenitude, says Shankaracharya in Atmabodha. Here, the passions are taken to mean all the contingent and transitory modifications which constitute the flow of forms. It is the domain of inferior waters, according to the symbolism common to all traditions. This is why the conquest of the Great Peace is often represented by an image of navigation. And that is one of the reasons why, in Catholic symbolism, the Church is represented by a boat. It is also sometimes represented by a war. And the Bhagavad Gita can also be interpreted in this way, as could likewise the theory of the holy war, or jihad, according to Islamic law. Let us add that the walking on the waters symbolizes domination over the world of form and change. Vishnu is called Narayana, he who walks on the waters. A connection with the Gospels, where Christ is precisely seen walking on the waters, is inevitable here. Chapter 11. The location of spiritual centers. The question as to where the supreme country was actually situated has been left to one side until now, partly because it is such a complex topic, but also because it has been peripheral to the point of view we wished to express. There is every reason for supposing that there have been several successive locations, each corresponding to different cycles, themselves subdivisions of another more drawn-out cycle called the Manvantara. Were the whole cyclical content somehow placed outside of time, there would be seen to be a hierarchical order in this determining of positions that correspond to the way traditional forms were established. Forms that are themselves no more than adaptations of the principal primordial tradition dominating the entire Manvantara. At this point, it must be repeated that it is possible to have several subsidiary centers existing at the same time as the principal center, attached to it and reflecting its image. This can rather easily create confusion, since these dependent centers, being more overt, are, for that reason, more conspicuous than the supreme center. Adapting St. Yves's terminology borrowed from the symbolism of the tarot, the supreme center is, in relation to other centers, like the closed zero of the 22 arcana. In reference to this last point, the similarity between Lhasa, center of Lamaism, and Agartha has already been indicated. Even in the West, at least two cities, Rome and Jerusalem, show topographical situations suggesting a comparable origin. It has already been explained that Jerusalem is a manifested image of Melkizedek's mysterious Salem. In fact, there existed in ancient times what one could call a sacred or sacerdotal geography through which precise laws, Plato's Timaeus appears to contain certain veiled allusions to the science in question, determined the position of cities and temples. This indicates the links that existed uniting sacerdotal art and royal art with the art of the builder. Note here what we said about the title of Pontifex. Note also that the expression royal art has been maintained by modern masonry. And the reason that ancient guilds and corporations actually did possess a true initiatory tradition. For the Romans, Janus was at once both the god of initiation to the mysteries and the god of corporations of craftsmen, Collegia Febrorum. There is a particularly significant fact in this double attribution. Between the foundation of a town and the development of a doctrine, or of a new form of tradition arising through adaptation to conditions defined by the time and the place, there was already a certain relationship which resulted in the construction of the town symbolizing the unfolding of the doctrine. We will use as an example the symbol of Amphion building the walls of Thebes by the sounds of his lyre. We will shortly see what is indicated by this name of the town of Thebes. The importance of the lyre in Orphism and Pythagoreanism is well known. Note that instruments of music playing a similar role are often mentioned in Chinese tradition, and it is evident that what is said about it must also be understood symbolically. Naturally, the most meticulous precautions were taken when selecting the site of a town destined to become the metropolis or center for a specified area of the world, so that the names of such towns merit careful study, as do the reported circumstances of their foundation. Where names are concerned, a few examples can be found in what has been said previously, particularly in connection with those connected with the idea of whiteness, and we will indicate a few more. Much could also be said about the sacred objects, to which, in some cases, were linked the very power and preservation of the city. It was thus for the legendary Palladium of Troy. Thus also were in Rome the shields of the Sali, which were said to have been cut from a meteorite in the time of Numa. The College of the Sali was composed of 12 members. These objects were supports for spiritual influences, as was the Ark of the Covenant for the Hebrews. Such a town or center existed in pre-Hellenic Crete. The name Minos is itself a sufficient indication in this respect, as was Menes where Egypt is concerned. Refer also to what we have said of the name of Numa for Rome, and recall the significance of the name of Shlomo for Jerusalem. In relation to Crete, let us point out in passing the use of the labyrinth as a significant symbol by builders of the Middle Ages. The oddest thing is that covering the circuit of the labyrinth traced on the floor of some churches on foot was considered a substitute for a pilgrimage to the Holy Land for those who could not achieve the latter. And it seems that there were several in Egypt, probably founded in successive epochs, like Memphis and Thebes. That Delphi played this role for Greece has already been noted. Its name calls to mind the name of the dolphin, whose symbolism is very important. Babylon is another remarkable name. Bab Ilu signifies gateway of heaven, which is one of the qualities applied by Jacob to Luz. It can, besides, also have the meaning house of God, like Bethel, but it becomes synonymous with confusion, Babel, when the tradition is lost. It then is the reversal of the symbol, Janua Inferni, taking the place of Janua Coeli. The name of the latter, also denoting the Greek city, is of particular interest as a designation of a spiritual center, as it is plainly cognate with the Hebrew Thabah, or Noah's Ark of the Great Flood. This is itself another representation of the supreme center, especially in the sense of preserving the tradition in a sort of veiled state. This state is comparable to the one represented by the egg of the world, for the beginning of a cycle containing in seed form all the possibilities which will develop during the cycle. In a similar way, the ark contains all the elements destined for the restoration of the world, which are thus the seeds of its future state. During a transitory period which is like the interval between two cycles and which is marked by a cosmic cataclysm destroying all prior conditions to give place to a wholly new state. One more function of the Pontificate is to ensure the passage or the traditional transmission from one cycle to the other. The construction of the ark has here the same meaning as that of a symbolical bridge, as both are equally destined to allow the passage of the waters, which has, besides, multiple significance. The role of Noah. It is also noteworthy that Noah is said to be the first to plant the vine, Genesis 9:20, a fact to be connected with what was said earlier regarding the symbolic significance of wine, and its role in rites of initiation with regard to the sacrifice of Melkizedek. The role of Noah in the Bible is very similar to that played in the Hindu tradition by Satyavrata, who subsequently became under the name Vivaswata the current Manu. This latter tradition is applied to the commencement of the present Manvantara, whereas the biblical flood marked the advent of another more restricted cycle. Within this same Manvantara, one of the historical meanings of the biblical flood can be connected to the cataclysm in which Atlantis disappeared. They do not represent the same event, but simply two analogous ones. The same remark can naturally be applied to all the flood traditions met among a very great number of peoples. There are some which concern still more particular cycles, as is the case with the floods of Deucalion and Ogyges among the Greek. As is the case with the floods of Deucalion and Ogyges among the Greeks. It is worth mentioning the association that exists between the symbolism of the ark and that of the rainbow, and which is suggested by the description in the Bible of the rainbow appearing at the culmination of the flood, as proof of the alliance between God and earthly creatures. Genesis 9:12-17. During the cataclysm of the flood, the ark floats on the ocean of the inferior waters. When the rainbow appears in the clouds, in the region of the superior waters, to signify the re-establishment of order out of chaos, and the subsequent renovation of all things. Ark and rainbow form a strictly analogous relationship, inverse and complementary to each other. The convex shape of the ark is directed downwards, that of the rainbow upwards, so that in meeting they comprise the two halves. These two halves correspond to those of the egg of the world as the superior waters and the inferior waters themselves. During the period of trouble, the superior half became invisible, and it is in the inferior half that there happened what Fabre d'Olivet calls the accumulation of species. The two complementary figures concerned can, furthermore, from a certain point of view, be compared to two lunar crescents turned inversely towards each other, one being, as it were, the symmetrical reflection of the other in connection with the separating of the waters, which refers to the symbolism of Janus, one of whose emblems is, in any case, the ship. To be noted also is that there is a kind of symbolic equivalence between the crescent, the cup, and the ship, in that the word vessel serves to designate both the latter two at the same time. The holy vessel is one of the most frequent names for the Grail in the Middle Ages. Upwards, so that in meeting they comprise two halves, of a circular or cyclical form, which had been in fact complete at the beginning of the cycle. This form is the vertical slice of a sphere. Its horizontal cut is represented by the circular girdle of the terrestrial paradise. This sphere is again the egg of the world. The terrestrial paradise is situated in the plane which separates it into its two superior and inferior halves, i.e., at the limit between heaven and earth. The latter divided by a cross formed by the four rivers issuing from a polar mountain. These four rivers correspond to the four letters which form the word Pardes, according to the Kabbalists. We have pointed out elsewhere their analogical connection with the four rivers of hell, Le Esoterisme de Dante, 1957 edition, page 63. The reconstitution of the whole necessarily takes place at the end of the same cycle. But note that in the design of the celestial Jerusalem, the circle is replaced by a square. This substitution corresponds to the replacement of the vegetable symbolism by the mineral symbolism, the significance of which I've indicated elsewhere, Le Esoterisme de Dante, 1957 edition, page 67. The 12 gates of the celestial Jerusalem naturally correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac, as well as to the 12 tribes of Israel. There is therefore a transformation of the zodiacal cycle, following the arrest of the rotation of the world and its fixation into a final state, which is the restoration of the primordial state once the successive realization of the possibilities it contained is completed. The tree of life, which was at the center of the terrestrial paradise, is equally at the center of the celestial Jerusalem, and here it bears 12 fruits. These are not without certain connection with the 12 Adityas, such as the tree of life itself has with Aditi, the unique and indivisible essence whence they have issued. To indicate achievement of what the Hermeticists symbolically called squaring of the circle. The sphere representing the development of possibilities through the expansion of the primordial central point is changed into a cubic form on completion of this development, and when the final balance for the particular cycle is achieved. One could say that the sphere and the cube correspond here to the dynamic and static points of view, respectively. The 6 faces of the cubes are orientated according to the 3 dimensions of space, as are the 6 arms of the cross traced from the center of the sphere. Where the cube is concerned, it is easy to see a connection with the Masonic symbol of the cubic stone, which is also connected to the idea of completion and perfection, i.e. the realization of fullness of the possibilities implied in a certain state. Chapter 12. Some conclusions. One conclusive piece of evidence emerges quite clearly from the corresponding testimony of all traditions, that an archetypal Holy Land does exist, that it is the prototype for all other Holy Lands, the spiritual center to which all others are subordinate. The Holy Land is also the land of the saints, the land of the blessed, the land of the living, and land of immortality. All these titles have equal validity, including that of the Pure Land. Among the Buddhist schools which exist in Japan, there is one, the Gyodo, whose name is translated as Pure Land. This recalls the Islamic denomination of the Brothers of Purity, Ikhwan es Safa, not to mention the Cathars of the Western Middle Ages, whose name signifies pure. Besides, it is probable that the word Sufi, indicating Muslim initiates, or more precisely those who have reached the final goal of initiation, like the yogis of Hindu tradition, has exactly the same significance. In point of fact, vulgar etymology, which derives it from suf, wool, of which the clothing worn by the Sufis was supposed to be made, is very unsatisfactory, and the derivation from the Greek sophos, sage, while appearing more acceptable, has the inconvenience of calling on a term foreign to the Arabic tongue. It seems preferable, therefore, to accept the interpretation which derives Sufi from Safa, purity, which Plato aptly bestows on the abode of the blessed. The symbolic description of this pure land can be found towards the end of Phaedo, translated by Mario Munier, pages 285 through 289. It has already been noted that a kind of parallel can be drawn between this description and the one made by Dante of the terrestrial paradise. John Stewart, The Myths of Plato, pages 101 through 113. This abiding usually takes place in an invisible world. But if one wants to understand this, one must remember that it is the same with spiritual hierarchies, spoken of by all traditions, and which represent in fact degrees of initiation. Besides, the various worlds are, properly speaking, states, not places, although it is possible to describe them symbolically as such. The Sanskrit word loka, which serves to designate them and which is identical to the Latin locus, contains in itself the indication of this special symbolism. There is also a temporal symbolism according to which these same states are described in the form of successive cycles, although time as well as space is in reality only a condition pertaining to one of them, so that succession is here but an image of a causal chain. In this contemporary period of our terrestrial cycle, that is to say, during the Kali Yuga, this holy land, which is defended by guardians who keep it hidden from profane view while ensuring nevertheless a certain exterior communication, is to all intents and purposes inaccessible and invisible to all except those possessing the necessary qualifications for entry. Should its setting in a definite location now imply that this is literally so, or is it only a symbol, or is it both at the same time? The simple answer is that both geographical and historical facts possess a symbolic validity that in no way detracts from their being facts, but that actually, beyond this obvious reality, gives them a higher significance. This can be compared to the multiplicity of meanings according to which the sacred texts are interpreted, and which, far from opposing or destroying one another, on the contrary, complement and harmonize each other in the knowledge of integral synthesis. From the point of view indicated here, historical facts correspond to a temporal symbolism, and geographical facts to a spatial symbolism. There is, moreover, a link or a necessary correlation between them, as there is between time and space themselves, and that is why the spiritual center may be in a different place according to the periods envisaged. We do not claim that this subject has been fully explored, far from it. Indeed, the relationships already discussed could lead to the elucidation of many more. On the other hand, this study has gone deeper than any preceding it, inviting reproach perhaps from some. We do, however, believe we have not said too much, nor anything that should not be disclosed, even though we may be less disposed than some people to dispute the fact that there is a proper moment for publicly discussing unusual material. Also, on this point of the right moment, note that in the circumstances in which we live today, events happen with such speed that many things, the reasons for which are not immediately obvious, may find real applications much sooner than expected, possibly in ways wholly unforeseen. Although we wish to refrain from anything that may smack of prophecies, these words of Joseph de Maistre, Soirees de St. Petersburg, 11th Conversation, it is hardly necessary in order to avoid any apparent contradiction with the cessation of oracles alluded to earlier on, and that Plutarch had already observed to point out that this word oracle is used by Joseph de Maistre in a very wide sense, the sense often given in current language and not the proper and precise sense it had in antiquity. Even truer today than a century ago are most fitting. To conclude with, we must be ready for an immense event in the divine order which we are traveling towards, with an accelerated speed that must astound all those who watch. Awesome oracles have pronounced already that the time is now. René Guénon, a biographical note. René Guénon was born in Blois, France on 15 November 1886 and died in Cairo, Egypt on January 7, 1951. Although well known in French intellectual circles since the early interwar years, his work at first remained almost unknown in the rest of Europe and the world. It is only since the 1940s that serious translations of the more important works have begun to appear in several countries, such as England, Italy, Spain, and Argentina. He felt it necessary to put into words the teachings he brought to light, and his thought, in order to rebut the attacks and insinuations that were directed against him from many directions. To call this thought his is a figure of speech only, as it was profound beyond any distinction of subject and object, and would conform to no current label or system of classification. He was in fact no Orientalist, although the spiritual East held no secrets for him, nor was he a philosopher, however much he clothed his thought in a rational language that ensured his position as a writer of exceptional clarity and power. Nor yet was he an occultist. Being referred to as one vexed him immeasurably, even though subjects forbidden by the limited horizon of modern science often flowed from his pen. One can deduce from his works that he would perhaps have accepted being described as a metaphysician, if this word is not also one of those which evoke in people images too false to be used without precaution. There is no doubt, however, that Guénon has been, in this final phase of Kali Yuga that humanity is at present living through, one of the most accurate interpreters of traditional doctrines. His work is of such breadth that it can only be compared with that of such intellectual and spiritual giants as were Shankaracharya or Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. René Guénon, only son of Jean-Baptiste Guénon, an architect, and Anne Leontine Joly, spent his childhood and early adolescence at Blois, receiving his early education from a maternal aunt who was a schoolteacher. This was followed by a period at the school of Notre Dame des Ides, an institution run by religious teachers. In 1902, he moved to college Austin Thierry, gaining his bachelor and following year in Lettres Philosophiques. In 1904, he left for Paris, where he studied higher mathematics at the Collège Rollin. Around 1906, he gave up his academic course due, it is said, to his delicate health. The interruption of his academic studies was followed by a period rich in encounters and productive of writings. In 1909, he founded La Gnose, or Gnosis, a periodical in which appeared the outlines of some of his more important future books: Symbolism of the Cross, Man and His Becoming According to Vedanta, and Principles of Infinitesimal Calculus. In 1910, he made the acquaintance of the Swedish painter John Gustaf Ajali, who had entered Islam in 1897 under the name of Abdul Hadi, and had been initiated into Tasawwuf, Islamic mysticism, by Sheikh Abdur Rahman Elish El-Kabir. La Gnose ceased publication in February 1912. On 11 July the same year, Guénon married Miss Berthe Lurie in Blois, and still in the same year entered Islam. Sometime during 1913 or 1914, he met a Hindu, Swami Narad Mani, who provided him with a dossier on the Theosophical Society. It was no doubt this material, at least in part, which he used to assemble a penetrating critique of that organization entitled Theosophy, A History of a Pseudo-Religion. During the years 1915 to 1919, he held a job as teacher at College Saint-Germain in Laye, lived a while at Blois, and was lecturer in philosophy at Sétif in Algeria. From there, he returned to Blois and thence to Paris. His first two books, A General Introduction to Hindu Doctrines and Theosophy, appeared in 1921, followed in 1923 by The Spiritualist Error. In 1924 and until 1929, he gave courses in philosophy at the College St. Louis. And in 1924, he chaired a meeting bringing together Ferdinand Ossendowski, Polish author of a book of his own travels in Mongolia and Tibet, which had excited a great deal of interest a few years earlier. See Chapter 1 of the present book. Translators: Gonzague, True, René Grousset, and Jacques Maritain. East and West appeared in 1924. In 1925, he was associated with the Catholic periodical Regnabit, He Will Reign, edited by Father Onizan, to whom he had been introduced by the archaeologist Louis Charbonneau-Lassalle of Loudun. This association lasted until 1927. Two more books, Man and His Becoming and The Esotericism of Dante, appeared in 1925, followed in 1927 by two more, Lord of the World and The Crisis in the Modern World. Guénon's wife died on January 15, 1928. In the same year, he began an association with the periodical La Voile d'Isis, The Veil of Isis, which in 1933 changed its title to Etudes Traditionelles, or Studies in Tradition. In 1929, he published two more books, Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power, and a short study, Saint Bernard. In 1930, Guénon left Paris for Egypt, where he settled permanently in Cairo, and where in 1934 he married the daughter of Sheikh Muhammad Ibrahim, who bore him 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, the last of them posthumously. All his other works were written during his sojourn in Egypt from 1930 to 1951, the year of his death at the age of 65. Over this period, he published The Symbolism of the Cross in 1931, The Many States of Being, or The Multiple States of the Being, 1932, Oriental Metaphysics, 1939, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, 1945, Perspectives on Initiation, Principles of Infinitesimal Calculus, and The Great Triad, 1946. Since his death, a number of books have been published, collating articles by Guénon that were never assimilated into the books he wrote himself, his major works. These have been put together according to the criteria of their various editors. Initiation and Spiritual Realization appeared in 1953, intended by the compiler as a sequel to Perspectives on Initiation. 1954 saw Perspectives on Christian Esotericism, 1962, Fundamental Symbols of the Sacred Science, and 1964, Studies on Freemasonry and Knight Compagnonnage. An anthology of almost all of Guénon's writings on Masonry and its symbols, published in the periodicals Etudes Traditionelles. In 1967 appeared Studies on Hinduism, followed by Traditional Forms and Cosmic Cycles in 1970. Reviews and Perspectives on Islamic and Taoist Esotericism in 1943, and Miscellanean 1976. Pietro Nutrizio. Translator's note: the titles of all Guénon's books have been given in English, even in those cases where no translation has yet been made. Other translations are given in square brackets.